Thatcher dropped his room keys on the carpet, and as he bent down to grab them, he literally froze in place, just staring backwards through his own legs. He slowly stood up, his face completely drained of all color, looking from me to the elevator doors that were just sliding shut at the end of the long hallway. We had just stepped out of that exact elevator less than 5 seconds ago, completely alone. But in this trembling, breathless voice, he asked me how many people I thought we had ridden up with, because he swore to God he just made eye contact with a man standing right inside the cab looking back at him. Looking back now, I really wish I had just told him we were leaving right then and there, but my stupid ego wouldn't let me. It all started when I had been working non-stop for about 3 or 4 months straight and was going absolutely stir-crazy. I hit up my buddy Thatcher, asking if he knew anyone out of town we could visit for a drinking trip to change the scenery. He suggested heading up to Jiahia to visit his old boarding school friend, Paxton, who had recently moved back to his hometown. Since we only planned a quick 2-day trip and figured we would just drink and leave the next day, we didn't bother booking a hotel in advance, deciding we would just find a place whenever we rolled into town. We had grabbed a room at this massive, slightly run-down hotel that sat right on the edge of Highway 14. It was the kind of place that looked massive from the outside, but felt like an absolute ghost town. After hours of driving on a motorbike in the blistering Dak Nong heat, I really did not care about the weird, heavy air in the lobby, or the fact that we seemed to be the absolutely only guests on the entire 3rd floor. We got to the hotel around 11:43 p.m., or maybe it was closer to midnight since the front desk guy was already half asleep, and I just wanted to wash the road grime off my skin. The heat up there is a different kind of miserable, making your skin crawl and stick to everything. So the first thing I did was head straight into the bathroom. It was a tiny 5x5 space with just a toilet, a sink, and a shower head. I locked the door from the inside, pushing the little button on the knob until it clicked and turned the water on. I grabbed this cheap hotel body wash. You know how guys are. We don't care about the difference between shampoo and body wash, so I just used the same bottle for everything. I squeezed a massive handful of it into my hair and let the thick suds run all the way down my back. I was standing there with my eyes squeezed shut against the soap, finally feeling somewhat relaxed, when I felt a finger drag down my spine. It was not a drop of cold water or a draft. It felt exactly like a singular, rough human finger, feeling like literal jagged ice, pressing into the base of my neck and dragging forcefully down between my shoulder blades, like someone trying to give me a deep tissue massage. I reached back immediately, swiping my hand over my wet skin, but I only felt the soap suds. I tried to convince myself it was just muscle spasms from riding the bike for 6 hours, just my nerves playing tricks on me, so I kept washing. But a minute later, the pressure came back, and this time it was aggressive. A heavy, blunt force dug so hard into my mid-back that I physically had to arch my spine and gasp because it genuinely hurt. I whipped around blindly, wiping the stinging foam from my eyes, ready to throw a punch at whoever was in there with me. But I was staring at a blank, moldy, tiled wall. The lock button was still pushed in on the door. I was entirely alone in that tiny box. I just wanted to get out of there, so I bent down quickly to twist the shower handle off. Right as I leaned forward, a massive, invisible force shoved me hard from behind, sending me slipping on the soapy tiles and crashing heavily onto my side. The wet smack of my body hitting the floor echoed loudly, making Thatcher yell through the door asking what the crap I was doing in there. My pride as a 24-year-old guy would not let me admit I just got shoved by the air, so I grumbled that everything was fine and scrambled to my feet. I dried off quickly, walked out wearing just my shorts, and sat on the edge of the bed. Thatcher was unpacking his stuff, but he suddenly stopped and pointed at my back, asking what kind of tight jacket I had been wearing to get a mark like that. I asked him what he was talking about, so he pulled out his phone, snapped a picture of my back, and handed it to me. Sitting right there across my shoulder blades was a solid, angry red welt, about 2 handspans long, looking exactly like someone had scraped a blunt tool down my skin. I just stood there staring at the screen for a second, completely speechless, before brushing it off, letting him go take his turn in the shower. While he was in there, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to just zone out. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a glass of water sitting on the TV stand, about 10 feet away, physically slide an inch across the wood. I blinked, thinking my eyes were just tired, but then the porcelain tea set next to it gave a distinct rattling clink, along with the fruit basket slightly shifting, followed by the entire heavy television set shifting slightly on its base. I slowly got up and walked over to the table. Looking closely under the harsh room light, I could clearly see overlapping rings in the thick layer of dust, showing that those cups had been moved around repeatedly. I looked down at the floor and saw identical, tiny square indentations clustered around the four legs of the heavy wooden bed, meaning the bed itself had been vibrating and shifting across the room constantly over time. I was literally staring right at the physical proof that this room was completely screwed up, but my stupid ego forced me to ignore it because I refused to be the guy who got scared away by some dust rings. We spent the afternoon wandering around the boring town and returned to the hotel at like 4:17 p.m. Our room was situated all the way at the very end of the third floor, meaning we had to walk down this suffocatingly long, narrow corridor. The old fluorescent tube lights above us were completely busted, doing this erratic, loud buzzing sound and violently flickering on and off the entire time we walked. That was the exact moment Thatcher dropped his keys and saw that guy standing in the elevator. Like I mentioned before, I just told him I was going to slap the shit out of him if he kept trying to mess with me, and shoved the key into the door myself. But the second I pushed the door open, the sound of rushing water hit us. The bathroom door was wide open, and the shower was blasting on full hot, steaming up the entire place. The TV was also turned on. I looked at the small coffee table, and the two complimentary water bottles had their plastic seals broken and caps unscrewed, sitting next to a bag of snacks that had been violently ripped open. The toilet lid was flipped up. I just stood there, completely stunned, desperately trying to convince Thatcher that I must have been incredibly forgetful and left all these things running before we left, even though I knew damn well I had locked the door behind us. We decided to call our local buddy Paxton to just bring some beers to the room so we wouldn't have to go back out into the heat. Thatcher put him on speakerphone and told him we were at this specific hotel on the highway. The line went completely silent for an uncomfortable amount of time. Paxton finally spoke up, his voice sounding tight and nervous, telling us he absolutely would not come to that hotel and practically begged us to just go out to a bar near the lake instead. We ended up meeting him at the bar, getting a few rounds in, and by the time it was dark, Paxton was drunk enough that he agreed to grab a case of beer, along with a bunch of beef jerky and roasted peanuts, and come back to our room to keep the night going. When we got back up to the third floor, Thatcher confidently walked ahead to unlock the door. He pushed it open, stepped half a foot inside, and then screamed at the top of his lungs. He violently jumped backward, pointing into the dark room, yelling that a guy had just sprinted right past his face, dashed through the room, and escaped out the back. Paxton and I rushed in, flipping the light switches, but the room was totally empty. I had specifically locked the heavy glass balcony door before we left because my expensive laptop was on the desk, but right now, that glass door was thrown completely wide open, letting the humid night wind violently whip the curtains around. Thatcher was frantically checking his bag, swearing up and down that he saw a grown man staring right at him before bolting. I checked my laptop, saw nothing was stolen, and told them both to calm down. Paxton was sobering up fast, looking pale and repeatedly asking if we could just leave and go to his house. I refused, telling him I drove all the way from the city to drink with him, and I wasn't going to let some stupid paranoia ruin my night. We sat up on the floor, sitting cross-legged in a triangle with the case of beer in the middle. We had agreed not to force anyone to drink, just pacing ourselves. About 30 minutes in, Paxton started shivering, rubbing his arms and complaining that his back was freezing cold, which made no sense because the AC had barely kicked in. He grabbed his shirt and put it on, looking down at his hands. Suddenly, his entire demeanor shifted. He grabbed a beer, shoved it toward me, and started aggressively demanding that I drink. His voice was completely different, carrying this heavy, thick local accent that he'd never used before, telling me that I was in his place now and I needed to show him some respect because he had been living in this room for a very long time. I just figured he was on some drunk hometown ego trip, so I snapped back, telling him I paid for the room and he needed to watch his mouth. As soon as I said that, Thatcher, who had been sitting quietly trying to diffuse the tension, suddenly slammed his hands on the ground. I looked over, and Thatcher's eyes were practically bulging out of his skull. He leaned forward, speaking in that exact same heavy, unnatural accent, telling me that he was old enough to be my father and asking how dare I speak to him like that in his own room. I completely lost my patience, swatted Thatcher's arm, and told him I'd punch him right in the fucking mouth if he kept playing games, warning him not to fuck with me. The second my hand made contact, Thatcher lunged across the beer cans and tackled me flat onto my back. He pinned my shoulders down, raining heavy, uncoordinated punches right into my face and chest, constantly screaming that I disrespected his territory. Paxton, who seemed to suddenly snap back to reality, jumped up and grabbed Thatcher by the collar, desperately trying to pull him off me. But the moment Paxton ripped Thatcher away, Thatcher collapsed like a rag doll, and Paxton instantly dropped to his knees, his face contorting into absolute pure rage, and he started throwing punches at me instead. They were literally passing this entity back and forth between their bodies like a sick game of relay, taking turns violently beating the holy shit out of me, while the other one tried to intervene, and they kept repeating that exact same phrase about respecting their room. I was just curled up, taking hits, completely exhausted and confused, until suddenly both of them just stopped moving and collapsed onto the carpet, panting heavily like they had run a marathon, completely knocked out. I rolled over, everything hurting, my face throbbing, and I was so pissed off thinking my friends had just orchestrated a prank to beat me up. I stood up, yelling at their unconscious bodies, ready to kick them awake. Right as the words left my mouth, the power in the entire room violently snapped off, plunging everything into a suffocating, pitch-black darkness. I instinctively stumbled backward, 2 steps in the dark, and my shoulder blade slammed hard into a solid chest. I knew for an absolute fact that Thatcher and Paxton were both lying unconscious on the floor in front of me, but the thing standing directly behind me was towering, and its body radiated a freezing temperature that seeped straight through my shirt like a block of industrial ice. I was absolutely paralyzed, unable to pull air into my lungs, when a breath ghosted right across the sensitive skin of my neck. A voice, dripping with that exact same heavy local accent, whispered right into my ear, "Did you like that beating I just gave you? Huh? You step into my place, you better show some damn respect." The overhead lights suddenly flickered back on with a loud pop. Simultaneously, I heard the heavy wooden door of the hotel room unlatch, swing wide open, and then violently slam shut with enough force to shake the walls, sending a gust of wind across the room. I dropped onto the edge of the bed, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't even clasp them together, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was going to break them. Thatcher and Paxton started groaning, slowly sitting up from the floor, looking around in total confusion. They looked at my battered purple face and actually asked me what happened and who the hell beat me up, casually asking if we were going to keep drinking. I totally snapped, screaming back at them that they could drink my A, and demanding to know if they seriously wanted to keep drinking, so whatever just possessed them could beat the shweet out of me all over again. I just grabbed my shoes and yelled at them to pack everything right fickin' now because we were leaving. We frantically gathered our loose items, but we couldn't find our shared green military backpack anywhere. Thatcher yanked the front door open to check the hallway, and there was our heavy backpack, sitting perfectly upright right in the middle of the corridor. The entity hadn't left the room when the door slammed. It had physically thrown our luggage out and slammed the door behind it, formally kicking us out of its space. We didn't say a single word. We grabbed the bag and practically fell down the stairs, running to our bikes. We crashed at Paxton's house for the rest of the night, but not before I had to literally stop at a late-night pharmacy to buy iodine and bandages, just to patch up my completely battered face and body. The next morning, We were sitting at a small street cafe near Paxton's house, and the silence between us was deafening. Paxton looked like he hadn't slept a wink, his hands fidgeting around his coffee cup. He finally looked up at my bruised face and confessed the truth about that hotel. He told us that the original owner of that massive building was a highly connected, ruthless underground boss back in the day, someone who ran massive rubber and cashew plantations, living half as a wealthy businessman and half as a mafia kingpin. Years ago, a local dispute got wildly out of hand, and the boss had a guy dragged up to that exact corner room on the 3rd floor for an interrogation. It went too far, and the owner's underlings brutally beat the guy until he stopped breathing right on those cold floor tiles. One of the lackeys took the fall and went to prison. Paxton explained that 10 or 20 years ago, during that chaotic era, guys with unlimited money and power could easily just pay off their desperate underlings to take the fall for the body. Because of that, the untouchable owner kept the hotel running like nothing ever happened. Paxton told me that every single local in Jiahia knows to never set foot in that building. It only exists to swallow up clueless, exhausted travelers pulling off the highway in the middle of the night. I just sat there, staring blankly down at my lukewarm coffee, feeling the sharp sting of the bruises swelling around my eye. Hearing the absolute reality of what happened in that room just left me sitting there in completely stunned silence. I realized then that the icy finger dragging down my spine in the shower, the heavy indentations under the bed, the guy in the elevator, and the freezing chest standing right behind me in the dark, none of that was just a lingering ghost trying to scare us. We hadn't just booked a bad hotel room, we had unknowingly paid money to lock ourselves inside a murdered man's permanent grave, and he was just making sure we knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped in there with him. I woke up to the entire wooden wardrobe violently shaking next to my head, accompanied by this deep, ragged growling sound coming from behind the heavy wooden doors. When I finally forced it open an inch, my best buddy was crumpled inside in the pitch black, soaked in sweat, his eyes bulging out of his skull like he'd just seen a massacre. He sobbed and refused to step out, muttering over and over that they'd locked him in, and the official kept glaring at him through the crack. I swear I almost lost my mind right then and there. If only we hadn't been so damn cheap. Back in late 2019, just 2 or 3 months before the pandemic shut the whole world down, we got sucked in by this targeted ad for a French colonial hotel in Dalat. TikTok wasn't really a massive thing yet, so this ad was just relentlessly spamming our Facebook and YouTube feeds. I was absolutely obsessed with Dalat back then. I'm talking about going up there 10 or 11 times a year. Sometimes my buddies and I were so crazy we'd ride our motorbikes up the mountain at 3 or 4 in the morning, grab breakfast, hang out, and ride straight back home by 5 or 6 p.m. Normally, my buddies Blake, Trent, and I would just split some crappy bunk beds for a few bucks, but this place looked like a museum and was going for barely $25 a night for a massive room. The promotional deal was a 2-bed setup for the 3 of us, meaning Trent and I had to share 1 bed, while Blake got the other. We hauled out on our motorbikes for 5 hours straight and got there around midday. The location was way off, though. It wasn't up in the pine forests, near the mountain passes, or along the winding Ancroyd Road like you'd expect. It was dead silent, miles away from the central market, tucked into some sleepy local neighborhood with 0 tourists or cafes around. No wonder they were running those dirt-cheap ads. This place was basically in the middle of nowhere, completely cut off from anything a normal tourist would actually want to see. As soon as I pulled off my heavy, full-face helmet in the courtyard, the air just smelled wrong. It was this intense, earthy scent of ancient moss and wet wood that felt like it hadn't seen sunlight in a century. A receptionist guy greeted us at the front door. He had this whole rehearsed speech and pulled out a faded catalog to show us the history of the building. He explained that it used to belong to a minor French official during the colonial era and was abandoned after the troops pulled out. He told us the new owner barely changed anything, just slapped on some fresh paint to keep the vintage vibe alive. The main selling point was the attic on the 4th floor, which was apparently the original working office of the French official, and they let guests tour it for free. We thought that sounded pretty cool, so we dropped our bags in our room and asked him to show us the way. There were no elevators, just these incredibly narrow wooden stairs that felt like they were going to snap under our weight. We reached the 4th floor, but the strangest thing happened. The receptionist just stood outside the doorway in the hall. He pointed inside and told us we could go in and look around, but he refused to cross the threshold himself. I asked him if we were really allowed inside, and he assured us it was fine, but he just stayed firmly planted in the hallway. I brushed it off, thinking he was just lazy and didn't want to babysit us on a free tour. We walked in, and the space was massive, taking up the entire attic, though the ceiling hung uncomfortably low. The air up there was practically solid. Every breath felt thick and heavy in my lungs, like the room was closing in on us. There was a huge wooden desk, an antique changing wardrobe, an old inkwell, a vintage typewriter, and one of those rotary phones from a century ago. I actually thought it was fascinating, but Trent immediately started running his mouth. Trent was the kind of guy who always had to act like he knew better than everyone else. He crossed his arms behind his back and started loudly insulting everything in the room. He told us we got scammed and claimed all the furniture was just cheap props. He pointed at the vintage rotary phone and laughed, swearing you could buy the exact same piece of junk at the Tohinthan second-hand market back in Saigon for maybe 15 or 20 bucks. He even sneered at the old typewriter, claiming you could find those cheap replicas sold everywhere. He pointed at the desk, loudly stating that his dad had better wood in his garage and that a real official would never use such cheap garbage. Blake completely agreed with him and joined in on the roasting. I actually went to a historical palace in Dalat before, and this stuff looked incredibly authentic to me, so I just kept my mouth shut and looked around. I didn't want to disrespect whatever history was left in that room. We headed back downstairs, and the bad luck hit Trent almost instantly. The stairs were barely 3 feet wide, and the moment Trent took his first step, he completely lost his footing and tumbled violently down the wooden steps. Blake and I couldn't help but laugh as he picked himself up, looking completely embarrassed. But it didn't stop there. Back in our room, Trent tried to sit on a regular wooden chair and somehow slipped right off it. Later, he was posing for a picture to look cool while shaving and ended up taking a gnarly chunk out of his lip with the razor, leaving it swollen and bleeding. Blake started having minor clumsy accidents too. We decided to rent bikes and go out for the evening, but Trent immediately got a flat tire and then a minor scratch on the side of the road. He was absolutely pissed, complaining about how his luck was completely cursed today. I mean, maybe he was just having a bad day, or maybe he really pissed something off up in that attic. We got back to the hotel pretty late. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe past 9 p.m. or something, but we were exhausted. We bought some soju and grilled meat, opened the main door and the windows to let the smoke out, and just sat on the floor drinking. Trent was sitting facing the open door leading to the hallway, while I had my back to it. After a few drinks, Trent suddenly scrunched up his face and asked aloud why a foreigner was pacing outside our room. I asked him what he was talking about. He described a tall, blue-eyed guy in really weird, outdated clothes walking back and forth in the hallway, muttering in a language he couldn't understand. I turned around, but the hallway was completely empty. I pointed out to Trent that the wooden floors in this old house were incredibly creaky, and there was no way a heavy guy could walk back and forth without making a single sound. We just walked down that hall, and every step echoed. Trent looked confused for a second, before rationalizing that the guy was probably just being polite and walking on his tiptoes to avoid disturbing us. We were a bit buzzed, so we just accepted that ridiculous logic and kept drinking. Eventually, Blake got too drunk and said he was going to sleep. He went into the bathroom to brush his teeth while Trent and I stayed behind to finish the last 2 shots of soju. Right as Trent and I clinked our glasses together, Blake yelled from inside the bathroom. He aggressively told us to stop messing with the lights and to quit trying to scare him. We just looked at each other in total confusion. I called out and asked what he was talking about. Blake walked out, wiping his face with a towel, and angrily accused us of flicking the bathroom lights on and off, cracking the door open, and whispering some broken Vietnamese mixed with fake French gibberish. mocking us for doing such a pathetic job at faking a foreign accent. Trent and I swore to him that we hadn't moved an inch from our spots on the floor. Blake just rolled his eyes, clearly thinking we were full of crap, and climbed into his bed, throwing an arm over his eyes to sleep. A few minutes passed. Trent and I poured the final shot. We clinked our glasses and threw the liquor back. Before we could even set the glasses down, Blake shot up from his bed, completely furious. He yelled at us to stop sneaking up to his bed and whispering in his ear. He was genuinely angry, complaining that he didn't even know a single word of French and that our prank wasn't funny. Trent and I were sitting on the floor at the foot of his bed the entire time. We tapped his leg and told him nobody was messing with him. He looked completely bewildered, claiming he was just drifting off to sleep when someone leaned right into his ear and started whispering rapidly in a foreign language. We quickly cleaned up the food and decided to call it a night. Trent and I went into the bathroom together to pee and rinse our mouths so we could finally sleep. We were in there for maybe 2 minutes when I heard this deafening thud, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged violently across the wooden floorboards. I rushed out of the bathroom and saw Blake sitting on the floor, at least 15 feet away from his bed. He was clutching his ankle, his face twisted in pain and pure rage. He started screaming at us, demanding to know why we kicked him off the mattress and dragged him across the room by his leg. I was totally frozen. Trent, who was still pretty drunk, laughed and told Blake he must have rolled out of bed because he was scared of the dark. But Blake kept swearing that unseen hands had gripped his ankles so hard it hurt, pulling him across the floor in a matter of seconds. I had to step in and calm him down, convincing him to just get back into bed. He told us our sick joke was absolute bullshit, cursed us out one last time, climbed back under his blankets, and passed out. I eventually fell asleep, but my sleep was heavy and uncomfortable. I woke up much later in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was around 3:14 a.m. The large, antique wooden wardrobe next to my bed, the one built with those old-school wooden hinges, was violently shaking. It wasn't just vibrating. The entire heavy structure was rattling against the floorboards, and from inside, I could hear this wet, guttural breathing. It sounded like an angry animal trapped in a box. I was completely paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned my head to wake Trent up, but his side of the bed was completely empty. I looked over at Blake's bed thinking maybe Trent got mad and went to sleep next to him, but Blake was entirely alone. I waited in the dark for a few of the longest minutes of my life, listening to the wood creaking and that awful breathing. I finally managed to whisper Trent's name into the dark room, asking if he was in the bathroom. A voice answered immediately from inside the shaking wardrobe. It was Trent, his voice cracking and trembling as he begged me to open the door and let him out, crying that the men were watching him and that he was too scared to move. I jumped out of bed, slapped Blake awake to turn on the main lights, and rushed to the wardrobe. I pulled the heavy wooden door, but it only cracked open a few inches. Trent was huddled in the corner of that cramped, pitch-black space. He was losing his fucking mind. He was stripped down to just his boxers, shivering uncontrollably, completely drenched in a cold sweat. His eyes were bloodshot and practically bulging out of his head, staring blankly ahead as if he was witnessing a total bloodbath. It took us several agonizing minutes of pleading to finally coax him out of that wooden box. Once he was sitting on the floor, hugging his knees and violently shaking, he started stuttering out his nightmare. He told us he was sleeping when he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of wooden boots approaching his bed. Before he could react, two invisible figures grabbed him by the armpits, hoisted him into the air, dragged him across the room, and threw him into the wardrobe, slamming the door shut. But the most terrifying part was what he saw from inside. He told us that when he looked out through the tiny vertical crack between the wardrobe doors, he didn't see our dark hotel room. He saw the attic from this morning. It was bathed in this blinding, unnatural daylight. The French official was sitting right there at his antique desk, writing documents while servants brought him tea. The silence in our room was absolutely suffocating as Trent described how the official would periodically stop writing, slowly turn his head, and glare directly into the crack of the wardrobe. The entity didn't say a word to him, but its unblinking, dead eyes projected a clear, deafening message straight into his brain. Look closely at what you called fake. They didn't even lay a finger on him. They just shoved him in that dark hole and forced him to keep his eyes wide open, making him watch the exact same stuff he had just called cheap fakes. Trent was forced to watch gruesome interrogations right in the middle of the room. He had to listen to the sickening crack of stingray leather whips, the muffled screams of people begging in a language he couldn't understand, and sudden, deafening gunshots that sent blood spraying right across the floorboards. Trent said he was trapped in there for what felt like hours, his heart on the verge of exploding from the sheer terror of being hunted. He said the torture only stopped the exact second I called his name from the bed. He watched the blinding daylight in the attic slowly fade out into total blackness, like someone turning a dial down, and the last thing he saw was the official smiling, a twisted, mocking grin before the darkness swallowed him whole. That was when I finally realized the terrifying logic behind all of this. Trent was the main instigator who completely disrespected the room, so he got the absolute worst of it with the primary haunting. Blake just blindly agreed and laughed, so he got hit with the secondary haunting of being pranked and dragged across the floor. But because I kept my mouth shut and genuinely respected the history, those entities never laid a single finger on me. We didn't even bother packing our bags properly. We just grabbed our keys, threw whatever we could find down those terrifyingly narrow stairs, and fired up our motorbikes. It was barely 4 a.m. We rode straight to the Dalat Central Market. When you experience something completely demonic like that, your brain just screams at you to find the biggest, loudest crowd of living people you can, just to wash off that dead energy. It was the only place on this entire mountain that had lights and people awake unloading vegetables at that hour. We parked our bikes by the roundabout and just collapsed onto those freezing concrete benches. Nobody said a single word. We just sat there, shivering in the dense fog, staring blankly at the ground, waiting desperately for the sun to come up so we could ride straight back to Saigon and never look back. I was paralyzed in that cheap hotel bed, just staring through the dark as the wooden closet door slowly creaked open. Out of the pitch-black gap, this pale, bone-white hand slipped out. No arm, just the hand, and it had these bright cherry-red fingernails. I literally stopped breathing as those sharp nails started scratching against the wood, making this awful scraping sound. I thought I was losing my damn mind. But let me back up, because I need to explain how I ended up in this nightmare. This was years ago when I was stuck in Saigon sorting out some complicated visa paperwork to get back stateside. My fixer hooked me up with this super cheap hotel right next to Choray Hospital, claiming it was run by some of his distant relatives. When I say right next to it, I mean I could hear ambulance sirens blasting non-stop 24/7. It was annoying as hell, but I figured I just needed a place to crash for a week. You have to understand the situation I was in back 10 years ago, around 2003 or 2004. I was young, totally out of my element in this massive, chaotic city, and the whole immigration process was just grinding me down. My local guy, the dude handling my documents, told me his family owned this newly built spot, and they could give me a crazy good discount. I think I was paying something like $10 a night, because I remember thinking it was insanely cheap even for local standards. I should have realized right then and there that when a spot is that cheap in a crowded metropolitan area, you are usually paying for it in some other messed up way. The first 2 days were just absolutely draining. It was not supernatural at all, just a massive headache. Choray is one of the biggest hospitals in the entire region, so the flow of emergencies is endless. I am not exaggerating when I say that the shrill, frantic wail of ambulance sirens would echo through my thin window glass every 10 to 15 minutes, all day and all night. The room itself was incredibly basic and smelled faintly of wet concrete and old mothballs. There was no air conditioning, just this dusty, sluggish ceiling fan that clicked rhythmically every time it made a rotation, and a heavy, dark wooden wardrobe shoved into the far corner of the room. I spent most of those first 2 days just lying on the stiff mattress, sweating in the humid heat, staring at the ceiling, and trying to ignore the constant reminder of life and death happening just a few hundred yards away. By the third day, I decided I needed to get out of that depressing room and do something normal to clear my head. I took a cab downtown to hit up some upscale shopping centers, places like Diamond Plaza and Saigon Square, where they sold genuine imported stuff. I was about to head back to the US, and I wanted to grab some fresh clothes for my upcoming interviews and just to feel good about myself again. I ended up spending a solid couple of $100, which was a pretty massive amount of cash to drop all at once back in those days. I bought some really nice button-down shirts, some tailored jackets, and a bunch of stylish new outfits, completely filling up these heavy shopping bags. When I finally got back to my hotel room that evening, I realized I had a stupid problem. I came to the city with just one small duffel bag containing a few basic t-shirts and shorts. Now I had all these expensive, perfectly pressed clothes. Since I was still stuck in that depressing room for at least another 3 or 4 days waiting on my final paperwork, I needed to keep these clothes crisp for my upcoming interviews. I definitely did not want to just shove them into my dirty bag where they would get all wrinkled and look like complete crap. That is when I looked over at that heavy wooden closet in the corner. Up until that point, I had not even touched the thing. I walked over and pulled the doors open, and the hinges gave off this dry, awful groan. Inside, there was just a single wooden rack holding a bunch of those incredibly cheap, flimsy wire hangers that you get from cheap dry cleaners. The kind of hangers that easily bend out of shape and make that irritating metallic clinging sound when they hit each other. I spent the next 20 minutes carefully hanging up all my brand new clothes. It felt really out of place, putting these high-end garments inside this cheap, musty-smelling wooden box, but I did not have any other options. I pushed the 2 heavy wooden doors completely shut, making absolutely sure they were flush against the frame. Then I just turned off the lights and climbed straight into bed. I do not know the exact time the first incident happened. Maybe it was past 2 a.m., but the hospital sirens had finally lulled into a rare moment of quiet. I was lying there in the dark, hovering right on the edge of sleep, when this very distinct sound pulled me awake. It was this hollow, metallic clinging noise, echoing from the corner of the room. It sounded exactly like those flimsy wire hangers, gently knocking into each other in this subtle, continuous clanking rhythm. My immediate thought was not ghosts or anything crazy like that. I am a pretty logical guy, so my brain instantly assumed it was just some annoying little stitch crawling around in there. I told myself it had to be a rat. A massive, filthy city rat had somehow gotten inside the closet and was crawling around in the dark, trying to chew on the expensive fabric of my new clothes. That thought pissed me off more than anything else. I was not about to let some rodent ruin hundreds of dollars worth of new gear. I threw the blanket off, stomped over to the wall, and flicked on the harsh fluorescent tube light. I marched right up to the closet, ripped the doors open, and fully expected to see some giant gray thing scurry into the corners. But there was absolutely nothing. My clothes were hanging perfectly still. I literally patted down the pockets of my new jackets, shoved the shirts apart, checked the dusty floor of the wardrobe, just completely baffled. It was completely empty. I briefly thought about taking all those expensive jackets down and packing them safely into plastic bags, just in case there really was a rat. But it was the middle of the night. I was running on fumes, and the thought of pulling everything down and folding all that crap again just seemed like way too much work. I let out this deep sigh, chalked it up to my exhausted brain playing tricks on me, and forcefully pushed the doors shut again. I made sure to press them hard, so they were totally sealed. Then I turned off the light and went back to bed. I was just starting to calm down and drift off again when I heard the sound return, but this time, it was not just the hangers clinging together. It sounded heavier, more deliberate. It sounded exactly as if someone was slowly running their hand through the row of clothes, parting the fabric so that the metal hook scraped and bumped along the wooden bar. It was this continuous, rustling, clanking noise that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. I forced my eyes open and looked toward the corner of the room. The room was bathed in this dim orange glow coming from the streetlights outside, and in that faint light, I saw that the right side of the closet door was hanging wide open. I am talking completely ajar. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I clearly remembered pushing those doors tightly shut. My brain immediately went into overdrive, trying to gaslight myself, desperately trying to find any rational explanation so I would not completely freak out. I convinced myself that the wooden latch was just old and stripped, and that the constant vibration from the spinning ceiling fan above my bed had somehow created enough of a breeze to slowly push the loose door open. It was a completely ridiculous, desperate excuse, but I forced myself to believe it. I got out of bed again, my legs feeling a little shaky this time, and I walked over to the closet. I did not look inside. I just grabbed the edge of the open door, slammed it shut, and leaned my weight against it until I felt the wood wedge tightly into the frame. I practically sprinted back to the bed and dove under the thin sheet. This time, I did not lie on my back. I rolled over and faced the completely blank concrete wall, putting my back to the rest of the room. I just wanted to block it all out, go to sleep, and leave this awful place the next morning. The room was so suffocatingly hot and quiet except for the distant wailing of another ambulance, until this entirely new noise started creeping into the silent room. This slow and rhythmic scraping sound that sounded like rough sandpaper against dry wood, or worse, like incredibly sharp fingernails slowly digging into the inside panel of that closet door. It was this agonizingly slow, wet scratching sound that made my throat go completely dry and my limbs just locked up, like I physically could not move an inch. I was just frozen there listening to this thing slowly drag its claws down the wood. I could not help it. I had to see what was making that sound, so I just barely shifted my head on the pillow, peeling one eye open to look over my shoulder toward the corner of the room. I heard the dry hinges let out this agonizingly slow squeal as the right door of the closet began to inch open again. But there was no wind this time. There was no vibration from the fan. From the pitch-black gap of the opening door, this pale, bone-white hand slipped out into the dim orange light. There was no arm attached to it that I could see. It was just a hand extending from the darkness, and the skin was this sickening, unnatural white like a dead fish floating belly up in the water. And the worst part, the part that is permanently burned into my retinas, is that the hand had these perfectly manicured, bright cherry red fingernails. The hand just gripped the edge of the wooden door, and those red nails started slowly scratching the surface, making that horrific scraping noise right in front of my face. Holy shit. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it was going to crack them. I violently snapped my head back to face the wall, squeezing my eyes shut so hard they ached. I am not even a religious guy. I have not been to church in over a decade. But in that moment of absolute primal fear, I just started aggressively reciting every single prayer I could remember from Sunday school when I was a kid. At first, I was chanting the words in my head over and over again, stumbling over the verses, practically begging whatever God was listening to build a wall between me and whatever the hell was crawling out of that closet. But as I kept praying, I started to gain a little bit of control over my own body. My breathing leveled out, my mind cleared, and I started reciting the prayers flawlessly, eyes closed, feeling this tiny shred of calm wash over me. I genuinely thought these holy words were working to banish the evil spirit away, but I was so off the mark. I had no fucking idea that throwing my religion in its face right inside its own space just completely pissed the thing off. Right at that exact second, right when I thought my praying was actually working and I was safe, I heard the closet door violently smash open with this deafening, explosive crack that shook the entire room. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, while this absolute hurricane of chaos erupted right behind my back. I heard the metal hangers aggressively flying through the air, hitting the walls and bouncing off the tile floor. I heard the heavy fabric of my brand new jackets violently snapping and slapping against the ground, things being forcefully hurled across the room and smashing against the wooden bathroom door. It sounded like an incredibly angry, invisible person was just tearing the entire wardrobe apart and throwing my belongings everywhere in a fit of absolute rage. The loud, clattering noise went on for what felt like an eternity, while I just laid there, trembling violently under my sheet, refusing to stop chanting my prayers. Eventually, the violent throwing stopped. The room fell into this heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by another ambulance siren wailing down the avenue outside. I knew I could not just lay there until morning. I gathered every single ounce of courage I had left in my body, scrambled frantically over the mattress, and violently slammed my hand against the light switch on the wall. The harsh fluorescent bulb flickered and buzzed to life, flooding the room with bright white light. I spun around, fully expecting to see some horrific entity standing in the middle of the room, but the room was empty. But what I saw completely shattered whatever logic I had left. Every single piece of clothing I had bought, every shirt, every jacket, was violently strewn across the dirty floor tiles. Some were bunched up near the foot of my bed. Some were thrown all the way across the room by the bathroom entrance. But the thing that made my blood run completely cold was the closet itself. The heavy wooden doors, the ones that had just violently smashed open, were now perfectly, seamlessly shut tight. I had not heard them close. I had not heard the hinges squeal or the wood knock against the frame. It was just sitting there in the corner, closed tight and completely silent, looking exactly the way I had found it. I stood there with my back pressed hard against the wall near the light switch, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not yell. I did not scream. I literally just looked at the closed closet and spoke out loud to the empty room in this very quiet, shaky voice, telling whatever was in there that I understood the message, that I would not use the space anymore, and that I just needed to gather my things. I kept my eyes glued to those wooden doors while I slowly crouched down and began scooping up my wrinkled clothes from the floor. I folded them as quickly and quietly as I could, shoving them forcefully into my small duffel bag. When I picked up the twisted, cheap metal hangers, I did not even entertain the thought of opening the closet to put them back. I just carefully stacked them on top of the dusty TV stand. I zipped my bag shut, sat on the very edge of the mattress near the door, and checked my phone. It was only a little past 3 a.m. I stayed completely awake, watching the closet and listening to the endless wailing of the Cho-Ray ambulances until the sun finally started to bleed through the window. Next morning, I grabbed my bags, bolted out of that place, and immediately called my fixer, calling him a lying piece of shit and demanding that he meet me at a nearby local coffee shop so I could rip him a new one and figure out what kind of cursed hotel he had thrown me into. When I confronted him and demanded to know if someone had died or been murdered in that closet, he looked super uncomfortable and finally spilled the truth over our coffee. Turns out, that hotel had only been open for a few months, built specifically to accommodate families dealing with long-term medical emergencies. At Cho-Ray, a few months prior, some parents had secretly sneaked their terminally ill daughter out of the hospital wards just to let her spend her final days in a relatively comfortable hotel room. They had this whole sneaky routine going on, where they would go into the hospital in the morning, pretend to get her medication and check in with the doctors, and then secretly sneak her back out to the hotel room in the afternoon so she could sleep comfortably. They kept doing this back and forth for about a week until her condition suddenly worsened, catching everyone off guard, and she passed away right there on that exact bed in my room. The hotel owners panicked. They had to secretly step in, coordinating with the hospital staff to quietly process the death and get the body shipped back down to the girl's hometown in the countryside so they could sweep the whole incident under the rug. But her family never bothered to return and perform any proper rituals or call her spirit back. The local entity was known to pick and choose its targets, sometimes haunting the bathroom or lurking under the bed, while other guests could stay for a month without a scratch. I got my visa sorted out, and I have been living in the States for over a decade now. But every time I think about how I was sleeping in a dad girl's sickbed, I don't even know what to say anymore. The toilet flushed. The heavy, rushing sound of water gulping down the drain sliced through the silence. It was aggressive, like someone had aggressively mashed the lever down so hard the spring clicked. I squeezed my eyes shut, annoyed, waiting for my friend to get back into bed. But then I realized I was staring straight at her back. She was already in her bed, fast asleep. Let's back up to how I even ended up in this mess. It was supposed to be a quick day trip into Cantho City. I mean, 20 miles sounds like a long distance, but a morning trip with an afternoon return is usually super simple. Even if I took it slow, it's only an hour-long drive back. I had some errands that should have wrapped up by mid-afternoon, giving me plenty of daylight to make the trip back home. Instead, I got stuck handling a bunch of bullshit until sunset, and then got talked into going out for food. By the time I checked my watch, it was past 7 p.m. The route back to my house has this one massive stretch that is completely deserted at night. Just pitch black, terrible pavement, and bad vibes all around. I was too spooked to ride my scooter back alone. My girl Daphne was with me, and since her parents wouldn't let me stay at their place for some delicate family reasons, like it just wasn't convenient to bring a guest over, she came up with the idea to just skip going home altogether and split a room with me instead. The plan was to just rent a cheap place for the night and check out super early the next morning. I had to make a quick call home to get my family's okay to crash in the city for the night, and once that was sorted, we booked a room for $10 at this decent-sized joint tucked inside a small alleyway near Ninkyu Wharf. It was a pretty tall building for being hidden in such a narrow alley. We paid the guy at the front desk, and he handed us a heavy metal key for a room up on the 3rd floor. We lugged our stuff upstairs right around 7 p.m. to drop everything off before heading back out. The room was incredibly small and suffocatingly basic. It had these 2 tiny single beds pressed up against the walls with maybe 3 feet of empty floor space between them. There was a cheap wooden vanity table in the corner, a bathroom near the entrance, an AC unit on the wall, and this massive, ancient-looking metal ceiling fan hanging right over the beds. You know the kind of fan I am talking about. Those heavy industrial ones that look like they belong in a factory from the 90s. We dumped our helmets and bags on the floor, cranked the AC on, and left to go walk around the night market by the river. We had a totally normal night eating ice cream and wandering around the crowded streets. Everything felt perfectly fine. I think it was maybe 9 p.m., or actually it might have been closer to 10 p.m., when we finally dragged ourselves back up to that 3rd floor room. We were exhausted and just wanted to sleep. Daphne grabbed her towel and went into the bathroom to wash her face first. While she was doing that, I walked over to the vanity table. The motel had provided these 2 complimentary bottles of water. They were those super cheap, flimsy plastic bottles where the plastic crinkles loudly just from holding them. I twisted the cap off one, drank about half of it, screwed the cap back on nice and tight, and set it right next to my phone on the table. I sat down and just started mindlessly scrolling through my phone while waiting for her to get out. A couple of minutes later, Daphne walked out of the bathroom with this absolutely disgusted look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she just complained about how gross the housekeeping was. She told me that the sink drain and the inside of the toilet bowl were choked up with these massive wet clumps of pitch black hair. She said it looked so freaking unnatural and disgusting that it literally gave her goosebumps. I remember brushing it off and telling her it was a $10 motel room, so we couldn't really expect a spotless cleaning job. We just assumed the previous guest had terrible hair loss, and the cleaners were just lazy as hell. We didn't think twice about it being anything sinister. We turned off the main lights and plunged the room into darkness. The night was pretty cool, so we just left the AC running on a low setting and completely ignored that creepy metal ceiling fan. I took the bed on the right side of the room, and Daphne took the bed on the left, which was positioned directly against the wall shared with the bathroom. I pulled the thin blanket up, closed my eyes, and tried to let the hum of the AC put me to sleep. It must have been right around midnight when I heard the first loud toilet flush coming from our bathroom. I could hear the hollow clank of the metal lever being forced down, followed by the heavy rush of water swirling down the pipes. Like I said earlier, I just lay there with my eyes closed, completely assuming Daphne had gotten up to use the restroom. I didn't even bother turning over. I was just waiting for her to finish so I could go back to sleep. I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound of the toilet tank slowly refilling with water. It is a very distinct, hissing sound that takes about a minute and a half to stop. The hissing sound finally stopped, meaning the tank was completely full. And then, not even 2 seconds later, the lever slammed down again. Clank. Whoosh. The water rushed down the pipes for a second time. My brow furrowed in the dark. I honestly just thought she was having stomach issues and needed a double flush, but my brain started doing the math. Her bed was barely 3 steps away from the bathroom door. I rolled over and opened my eyes to look at her side of the room, fully expecting to see the bathroom door open or see her shadow moving. Instead, the faint ambient light creeping in from the alleyway showed Daphne perfectly still in her bed. She was lying on her side, facing the wall, with her blanket pulled all the way up to her shoulders. She was passed out cold. My whole body went completely cold, and I just kept mentally repeating to myself that she must have sprinted back to bed while the tank was filling up. Like, she had to have run back. That was the only damn possible way. I kept my eyes locked on her form, not daring to move a muscle. I just lay there, barely breathing, listening to the hissing sound of the toilet tank filling up with water for the second time. 90 seconds passed. The hissing stopped. The tank was full. Clank. Whoosh. The lever violently slammed down for a third time. My eyes widened in the dark. There was absolutely no way. Daphne was right in front of me, completely motionless on her bed. No one had walked out of that bathroom. It scared the absolute crap out of me. I got full body chills. I reached my hand out across the empty space between our beds and fiercely whispered her name. Daphne shifted instantly and aggressively whispered back, asking me if I was hearing the toilet flushing too. She sounded terrified. She told me she was absolutely certain the sound was coming from our bathroom because the plumbing was vibrating right inside the wall her bed was pushed up against. The second it actually clicked that neither of us was inside that bathroom, my stomach completely dropped and I started to legitimately freak out. We were completely paralyzed. The idea of getting up and checking the bathroom was completely out of the question. The idea of running downstairs in the dark seemed impossible. We just huddled there on the edges of our tiny beds, trying to get as close to each other as physically possible without actually sharing a mattress. We stupidly agreed to just close our eyes and pray whatever was in there would get bored and leave us alone. About 10 minutes went by. The silence was suffocating. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, right above our heads, the ceiling fan groaned. We hadn't touched the switch. It had been completely busted all night, but suddenly, it let out this agonizing metallic squeal. I tilted my head up in the dark. The fan blades weren't spinning like a normal motor turning on. They were moving in these violent, unnatural jerks. It made this horrifying, grinding noise as the blades shifted exactly 1 inch, and then violently stopped. Squeal, shift, stop, squeal, shift, stop. It looked exactly like an invisible hand was gripping the dusty metal blades and forcefully cranking them around by sheer physical strength. We just stared at it, whimpering in the dark, holding onto each other's hands across the gap between the beds. The dragging, jerky motion lasted for about 15 agonizing seconds before the blades finally grinded to a complete halt. I was on the verge of tears. I squeezed my eyes shut and just kept telling myself it was bad wiring, just an old building with terrible electrical issues. I was desperately clinging to any shred of logic. And then it was pin-drop silent for a second before I heard this aggressive, violent crunching noise, like someone was literally stomping on a piece of trash right next to us, and I instantly knew it was that cheap plastic water bottle getting completely flattened out from all sides, followed by a sharp pop and the heavy splash of liquid hitting the floor tiles. We both shrieked and bolted upright in our beds. My eyes darted toward the vanity table in the corner where I had left my half-empty water bottle. The bottle was gone. I looked down at the floor. Lying directly in front of the closed bathroom door was my plastic water bottle. It was completely mangled, totally flattened out into a compressed disc of twisted plastic. But the most terrifying part was the cap. The plastic cap was still sitting perfectly upright and untouched right next to my phone on the vanity table. A long, dark trail of spilled water painted the floor tiles, starting from the base of the table and dragging all the way to the flattened bottle by the bathroom door. Something had unscrewed the cap, crushed the bottle with immense force, and tossed it across the room. That was it. That was the absolute breaking point. Daphne let out this choked sob and threw herself across the gap, landing right on top of me in my tiny bed. We were just this tangled mess of limbs, sitting completely bunched up, trembling so violently the entire bed frame was shaking. I knew we had to get the fuck out of that room right that second. We didn't even talk about packing. We didn't care about our helmets or our bags, and we definitely were not going to grab our shoes because we had left them right next to the TV stand by that side of the room. We just needed to reach the door. The only problem was the light switch was located right next to the front door, meaning we had to walk directly past the bathroom and the crushed water bottle to get to it. We forced ourselves off the mattress. We locked our arms together and took those 3 steps toward the door. Every single step felt like walking through deep mud. My chest was so tight I thought I was going to pass out. We reached the wall, and my trembling hand slammed against the plastic light switch. The harsh fluorescent bulb flickered on, and the second the light hit the room, everything exploded into absolute chaos. The flattened plastic water bottle lying in the puddle on the floor suddenly started violently jumping up and down by itself. Violently smacking against the wet tiles like an invisible hand was rapidly slapping it against the ground, sending drops of water spraying everywhere. At the exact same time, the heavy mechanical lever inside the bathroom toilet started aggressively slamming up and down on its own, just violently clanking and echoing off the tiled walls even though the tank had absolutely no water left in it. And right above us, that rusty metal ceiling fan started screeching and jerking its blades in that horrific, forceful grinding motion again. My brain couldn't even process the absolute chaos going on in there. The jumping plastic, the dry metal flushing, the grinding fan. It all happened simultaneously in this deafening loop that lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds, but I swear to God it felt like an absolute eternity. The air in the room instantly felt incredibly heavy and hostile. We didn't even look back. We screamed at the top of our lungs, yanked the heavy wooden door open, and bolted out into the hallway. We didn't go anywhere near the elevator. We threw ourselves down 3 flights of concrete stairs in complete darkness, our bare feet slapping against the steps until we crashed into the ground floor lobby. The lobby was pitch black. The owner had turned off all the lights to save money. We found him sleeping on a folding canvas cot behind the reception desk, completely wrapped up in a mosquito net. It was clearly a one-man family business, where he acted as his own receptionist and slept in the lobby just to pocket the whole profit. We just stood there, shivering in the dark, bare feet on the dirty floor, completely paralyzed because we were too terrified to go back upstairs, too scared to make the dark drive home, and we honestly didn't even dare to wake the guy up to complain. We just stood there for a few seconds, completely frozen and staring at each other in helpless panic, before finally spotting the small guest waiting sofa in the corner of the lobby. We just collapsed onto it. We huddled together, hugging our knees to our chests, violently shivering and jumping at every single shadow. We sat there completely paralyzed like that for a solid 30 to 45 minutes until sheer mental and physical exhaustion finally forced us to pass out sitting up. When daylight finally broke, the old man woke us up, super confused as to why we were curled up in the lobby. We were stuttering, practically in tears, trying to explain the absolute nightmare in that room. We were too terrified to even go back up for our bags. He actually had to walk up to the 3rd floor, pack up our clothes, our makeup, our shoes, and bring everything down to us. He handed back our IDs and took exactly $4 for the room. He completely ignored the original $10 price we agreed on, practically taking the cut as desperate hush money. As we were walking out the door, he looked at us, stone cold serious, and muttered, "I'm sorry, girls. Please don't tell anyone about this. Let me run my business." I just stood there, holding my bag. I didn't say a single word back. I just wanted to leave and never think about it again. There was someone standing on my hotel balcony. I could see their silhouette through the thin fabric of the curtains. The terrifying part wasn't just that I was on the 3rd floor. It was their posture. They were leaning against the railing, legs crossed, holding a cigarette with 2 fingers in this very specific, arrogant way. It was the exact same gray suit I had worn a few hours ago. It was my exact posture. Something out there was wearing my clothes, mimicking my exact movements in the middle of the night, and the only thing I couldn't see was its face. It makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about it. I shouldn't have forced my way into that room. The crazy thing is, I'm actually someone who has always believed in the supernatural. I've always been superstitious, but absolutely nothing could have prepared me for this. Let me back up. This happened about 4 years ago in Dak Lak, a mountainous province in Vietnam. My company sent me there for a business trip and pre-booked me into this sketchy 2-star hotel. I had absolutely no say in the matter. They just handed me the itinerary, and I took a taxi straight there from the airport. When I checked in, the guy at the front desk handed me the key to room 302. I took one look at it and hated it. No windows, suffocating, just a concrete box. I went back down and asked for a room with a view. I kept thinking about how it had been years since I last visited Dak Lak, so I at least needed a window to look at the scenery. He told me they were totally booked, but I had seen a room on the 3rd floor with a balcony, room 304. I pushed for it, offered him like $5 or $10 extra to make it happen. He gave me this deeply uncomfortable look, swallowed hard, and just nodded. He didn't say a single word of warning. I grabbed the key and headed upstairs, feeling pretty good about myself for getting an upgrade. The room itself was actually surprisingly spacious. It was meant for 4 people, featuring 2 large double beds, but I had the whole place to myself. The best part was the sliding glass door leading out to a small private balcony. I unpacked my things, hung up my clothes in the wooden wardrobe near the entrance, and got ready for work. I spent the entire day out at meetings, and then got roped into a heavy drinking session with some local clients. They were pouring these massive shots of some regional mountain liquor, and it had a serious kick to it. By the time I stumbled back to the hotel, it was around 10:45 p.m. I was completely exhausted, but my brain felt incredibly wired from all the alcohol. I was still wearing my tailored gray suit from the meetings. Instead of going straight to bed, I slid the balcony door open and stepped out into the freezing night air. I remember my exact body language in that moment because it becomes so messed up later on. I leaned my elbows heavily against the cold concrete railing, crossed my ankles, and held a cigarette loosely between my fingers. I just stood there for a while, puffing away, looking down at the completely deserted street below. Once I finished the cigarette, I tossed it, went back inside, and locked the glass door. I took off my gray suit, draped it neatly on a hanger inside the closet, took a quick hot shower, and made a brief phone call to my wife to tell her I was safe. Right around 11:47 p.m., my stomach started doing these aggressive flips. I had consumed way too much alcohol, and my absolute worst habit when I go out drinking is that I rarely ever eat any solid food during the session. I was absolutely starving. The hunger was actually keeping me awake. I grabbed the landline on the bedside table and dialed down to the reception. I asked the kid at the front desk if there was any late-night food spot still open nearby. He told me that the entire town shuts down early, and there was nothing open. I asked if he could just go into the hotel kitchen and whip something up for me. There was a really long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. He stayed quiet for so long that it just got super awkward. Then, he asked me a very specific question. He asked if I was the guest, staying in room 304. I told him yes, obviously. The second I confirmed the room number, his entire tone shifted. He became rigid and flatly told me that they absolutely do not serve food to that specific room. My brain was foggy from the drinks, and honestly, I just got really pissed off at the absolute crap logic of his statement. Why in the world did he need to confirm my room number before denying me service? Did the guests on the second floor get food? I raised my voice and practically ordered him to just go boil a pack of instant noodles and throw 2 eggs in it. I told him I would give him 100,000 dong, which is maybe $4, just for a damn bowl of instant soup. It was a stupid amount of money for noodles, but I was hungry and arrogant. I heard him stammering on the phone, sounding genuinely nervous, but he eventually agreed and hung up. I waited in the room for about 20 minutes. Finally, there was a very soft, hesitant knock at my door. I was still feeling extremely petty about the phone call. I walked over, unlocked the door, and pulled it open just a few inches. I didn't even look out into the hallway. I just turned my back immediately and walked straight toward my bed. I didn't say a damn word. I just sat down on the mattress, fully expecting the kid to walk in and place the food on the table like a proper room service delivery. But he didn't cross the threshold. He just stood out there in the dim corridor. I heard his voice trembling as he called out to me, pleading with me to come back to the door and take the tray myself. He said he couldn't come inside. I sat there in complete silence, rolling my eyes, thinking this kid was just being lazy and dramatic. I refused to answer him. A few seconds later, he begged me again, his voice cracking with genuine panic. I let out an annoyed sigh, pushed myself off the bed, and marched back to the door. I snatched the metal tray right out of his shaking hands with this heavy scowl on my face. He didn't even look me in the eye. He just stared at the floor and whispered a request for me to leave the dirty dishes out in the hallway when I was finished. I didn't say a word to him. I just nudged the door shut with my foot until it clicked, locking him out. I took the tray to the small table and sat down. The bowl of noodles was steaming hot, practically boiling. I was so insanely hungry that I didn't even care. I just used the chopsticks to shovel all the solid noodles and the eggs into my mouth as fast as humanly possible. I completely ignored the broth because it was way too hot to drink and I just wanted to sleep. I left exactly half a bowl of thick, oily broth sitting there. I picked the tray back up, opened my door, placed it carefully on the carpeted floor in the hallway, and locked the deadbolt. I turned all the lights off, stripped down to just my boxers, and crawled under the heavy floral blanket. I fell asleep facing the interior wall of the room. I have no idea exactly what time it was when I woke up, maybe somewhere around 2:13 a.m., but the temperature in the room had plummeted. It felt like walking into a meat freezer. I shivered and rolled over onto my back. That was when I saw it. Before I went to sleep, I had personally dragged the heavy blackout curtains across the sliding glass door, making sure they overlapped in the middle so no street light could get in. But right now, those curtains were pulled wide open. The pale moonlight was spilling directly into the room, and there was a tall, dark silhouette standing out on my balcony. The figure was facing away from me, leaning casually against the concrete railing. It had its ankles crossed and one arm resting on the ledge, holding a cigarette between two fingers. I stared at the shape, my breath catching in my throat, because I realized I was looking at my exact gray suit. It was the same broad shoulders, the same fabric, standing in the exact same arrogant posture I had assumed just a few hours earlier. Something had dressed itself in my clothes and was reenacting my exact movements in the middle of the night, and the only thing I couldn't see was its face. I panicked. I threw the blanket off and sat up violently, ready to shout, but as soon as my eyes adjusted to the sudden movement, the balcony was completely empty. There was no smoke. There was no figure. The moonlight just illuminated the bare concrete. My chest was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat there on the edge of the bed, trying desperately to apply basic logic to a completely screwed up situation. I convinced myself that the strong regional alcohol was finally messing with my visual cortex. I actually forced myself to stand up, walk over to the wooden closet, and yank the door open. My gray suit was hanging right there in the dark, completely untouched. I let out a shaky breath, feeling incredibly stupid. I walked over to the balcony, grabbed the thick fabric of the curtains, and yanked them tightly shut again. I climbed back into the bed, shivering in just my boxers, because the natural mountain air of Dak Lak at night is freezing, almost exactly like daylight. I pulled the heavy cotton blanket all the way up over my shoulders, burying my face into the pillow, and closed my eyes to force myself back to sleep. I had been lying perfectly still for maybe 3 minutes when it happened. It was pin-drop quiet in the room until I felt an ice-cold, fully formed human hand press flat against the bare skin at the back of my neck. I couldn't move. The paralysis was instant. The air was suffocating as I felt those freezing, heavy fingers slowly and deliberately begin to trace a line straight down my spine, dragging right down the center of my back with an agonizing slowness. And the worst part was that I could feel the individual joints of the fingers pressing deeply into my flesh, tracking all the way down past my waist, and I swear to God, it kept dragging its fingers right down over my bare A. Just this heavy, freezing weight, pressing me down into the mattress in the pitch black. I absolutely lost my fucking mind. I didn't even scream. I was so absolutely terrified my throat just locked up. I kicked the blanket violently into the air and vaulted across the room toward the light switch. I slapped the plastic panel, flooding the room with bright artificial light, and spun around with my fists clenched. The bed was completely empty. The crumpled blanket was just lying there. I was just standing there hyperventilating with goosebumps all over my body when I heard this loud noise like fabric ripping right behind me, and I spun around just to see those heavy curtains yanking themselves wide open all on their own. I looked through the glass door. The figure was back. It was standing right there in my gray suit, leaning against the railing. Its legs were crossed, both arms were resting up on the balcony ledge, and its head was tilted back arrogantly as it mimicked taking a drag from a cigarette. I didn't wait around to see a face. I didn't want to know what it looked like. I lunged for the front door handle, ripped the deadbolt open, and threw myself out into the hallway. I stood in the corridor, gasping for air, clutching my chest to feel my own heartbeat. The hallway was absolutely silent. As I stood there trying to process the insanity, my eyes drifted down to the floor by my door. The room service tray was exactly where I had left it. The spoon and the chopsticks were in the exact same resting position, but the ceramic bowl was bone dry. Every single drop of that thick, boiling hot broth was completely gone. The inside of the bowl was wiped completely spotless. Something had crouched right outside my locked door in the total darkness and slurped the entire thing dry. I felt incredibly nauseous. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely press my palms together. I stood in the doorway, clasping my hands tight in front of my chest in prayer, repeatedly chanting Mofat over and over again, and just begging whatever was inside that room to let me pack my things. I practically crawled back inside, keeping my eyes glued to the floor. I grabbed my clothes in a messy bundle, not even bothering to put a shirt on. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door. It was almost 3 a.m. I abandoned the third floor entirely and ran down the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. I burst into the lobby, standing there shivering in absolutely nothing but my boxers, completely stripped of whatever pride I had left. The kid was still sitting at the front desk, looking exhausted and pale. I slammed 100,000 dong onto the counter. I begged him to give me back room 302, the suffocating concrete box, and pleaded with him to ride the elevator back up with me, just to get my heavy suitcase. He didn't touch the cash. He just looked at me with this profound sense of pity, grabbed a master key, and agreed to help. We stepped into the elevator together. The metal doors slid shut, and the low humming sound of the motor started as we began our ascent. I was leaning against the metal wall, trying to calm my erratic breathing. I looked at the kid and asked him a question that had been gnawing at the back of my mind. I asked him why he was so terrified to bring the food into my room earlier when I opened the door for him. The kid looked up at me, the last bit of color completely draining from his face. He swallowed hard. He told me that when I opened the door and walked back to my bed, he heard me yell at him. He looked me straight in the eye and said he heard my exact voice, complete with my distinct Saigon accent. He said people up there in the mountains instantly pick up on city accents, so there was zero chance he misheard it. The voice echoed right from the dark corners of the room. "Bring it in for me." My stomach completely dropped, because I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that when I opened that door, I was totally silent. I didn't say a single word. Whatever was waiting inside room 304 had stolen my voice to assert dominance over that space. I didn't even let the elevator doors open fully on the third floor. I just slammed my hand on the button for the lobby. I told the kid that I was sleeping down there with him, and I didn't care if it was on a chair, because I was absolutely not going back up there. He didn't argue. He just pulled out a woven mat and let me crash on the lobby floor. He admitted he knew the room was messed up. He told me he used to be a bit of a delinquent, always partying and getting into trouble. So his family, who owned the place, forced him to manage the hotel to straighten him out. He just had the absolute worst luck getting stuck with a haunted building. I flew back to Saigon the very next morning. I never got an explanation for what wore my clothes, or what drank my soup, or what used my voice. Now, whenever my wife and I travel, I stand in front of the hotel room door and knock 3 times before turning the handle. It's just, I don't know. It's all I can do. I tilted my head back to look up at the 3rd floor balcony of the hotel we had just practically sprinted out of, and my stomach completely dropped. There, stuck to the very top edge of the glass door on the outside, where absolutely no human could reach without a scaffold, was this long yellow paper talisman, roughly the size of an adult human hand, flapping in the wind. My legs went totally numb. The crazy thing is, this whole nightmare started out as a totally normal weekend. I always took the 60-kilometer ride down to see my best friend Tatum, because it was our weekend ritual to just hang out in her cramped little rental room and shut out the rest of the world. I usually worked all week in Saigon, so riding my scooter down Highway 1A to Tanan City was my ultimate escape from the chaos. We would just lock the door and do face masks and gossip about everything under the sun while eating snacks on her tiny floor. Sometimes our buddy Nolan would swing by to eat hot pot with us before heading back to his own place. It was always just a super safe and cozy bubble. But that specific weekend got completely derailed when Tatum texted me saying her younger cousin from another town was coming up to visit, and she felt obligated to let him crash at her place. I told her it was fine, and that we could just throw some blankets on the loft for him while we slept downstairs. But then 9 p.m. rolled around, and this kid did not just show up alone. He brought like 3 or 4 local guys from the Long An area with him. Just some loud frat boy types he knew. They came stomping into the tiny rental room smelling like cheap beer, and immediately started taking up all the space, talking loudly, and basically making it clear they were planning to drink and sing karaoke all night long. I am super introverted, and dealing with a bunch of loud, drunk, 20-year-old dudes was just absolute bullshit. I pulled Tatum aside and whispered that we should just let them have the room and go book a cheap hotel nearby so we could actually get some sleep. She was super pissed off about it too, so she totally agreed. We called Nolan since he had a car, and he drove us around looking for a place. We eventually found this pretty large hotel sitting right across from the main bus station. It looked completely normal and well lit. We walked up to the front desk and booked a standard room for the night. The receptionist handed us a key card with the numbers 313 printed right on the plastic. We walked over to the elevator and stepped inside, and that was when the first really weird thing happened. I reached out to press the button for our floor, but my finger just hovered there in midair. The metal panel had buttons for floors 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. There was absolutely no button for the 3rd floor. It was just an empty flat metal space where the 3 should have been. I remember letting out a little awkward laugh and telling Tatum that maybe the owner was just super superstitious about the number 3 or something. I pressed the button for the 4th floor, assuming we would just take the stairs down 1 level. But the weirdest part was that the elevator doors opened and the digital display above us clearly read floor 3. We stepped out into this long hallway that was perfectly clean but just felt incredibly heavy and weirdly stagnant, almost like the air conditioning was pumping out dust instead of cold air. We found room 313 and swiped the card. The door clicked open, and everything inside looked exactly like a standard cheap hotel room. We locked the door behind us and turned on every single light in the room. We just sat on the bed chatting for a couple of hours to shake off the weird vibe of the elevator. The thick curtains covering the balcony door were completely drawn shut. Around 11 p.m. I started getting really sleepy. Usually, at her rental place, the morning foot traffic and people going to work outside would wake me right up. But this hotel room was just so unnervingly, absolutely silent. I realized that if we kept the room pitch black, nobody would disturb us, and we would probably sleep in way too late the next morning. I told Tatum I was going to pull the curtains open just a crack so the morning sun would wake us up naturally. She nodded from her spot, sitting cross-legged on the bed. I walked over to the main light switch on the wall about 6 feet away from her. I flicked the switch down, The room plunged into darkness for exactly 1 second before Tatum let out this raw, animal-like noise that practically blew my eardrums out. She started violently thrashing on the bed and screaming at the top of her lungs to turn the lights back on, while wildly pointing her trembling finger toward the balcony door. I slapped the switch back on and asked her what the hell was wrong. She was hyperventilating and begging me to look outside to see if someone was standing out there. I honestly thought she was just trying to scare me, because we were in a creepy hotel. I confidently walked over to the glass door and pulled it open, stepping out onto the third-floor balcony. I looked left and right and down at the empty street. There was absolutely nothing out there. I walked back inside and locked the glass door, telling her she was just seeing shadows and that she needed to seriously chill out. I did not even wait for her to respond. I just turned around and flicked the light switch off for the second time. Click. The absolute darkness only lasted a fraction of a second before Tatum let out another deafening shriek and practically vaulted across the mattress, tackling me straight to the floor, scaring the living crap out of me. She was clutching my shirt so hard her knuckles were white, and she was begging me to turn the light back on with this hyperventilating sob that sounded like an animal in a trap. The terrifying part was I could feel the temperature in the room just plummet, as if something massive and freezing was standing right behind her in the dark. I slammed my hand against the wall and hit the switch. The lights flickered on. Tatum's face was completely drained of color. Her eyes were practically bulging out of her skull, and her jaw was violently trembling. She grabbed my arm and cried that we needed to check out right that very second. Since this was just a totally unplanned escape, we didn't have any luggage, just our small everyday purses, so we literally grabbed our stuff and bolted out the door in under a minute. We ran down the hall and practically threw the keycard at the confused receptionist, checking out after barely 2 hours, though I remember the receptionist didn't even question it and just charged us for the full night anyway. We ran out to the sidewalk to wait for Nolan to pick us up, which leads right back to that moment I looked up and saw that yellow paper talisman, roughly the size of an adult human hand, stuck to the outside of the third-floor glass. It was just silently flapping up there in the dark, right outside the exact room we were just in. Nolan pulled up a few minutes later since he actually lived right there in Tanan City, and we practically dove into the back seat. We drove around trying to find another hotel, but Tatum was just sitting there completely motionless. She was staring straight ahead with her eyes wide open, but she looked completely hollowed out. She whispered that her shoulders felt like they were carrying cinder blocks, and that her skin was freezing from the inside out. The thing is, a night down in Longan Province is incredibly humid and stagnant. There is zero breeze, but I could physically see her shivering as if she was standing in a freezer even though the car was warm. She suddenly grabbed my hand and begged to just go back to her rental room, saying it was the only place she felt safe. I agreed immediately because she looked like she was about to pass out. We got back to the rental house, and her cousin and his friends were still drinking outside. I was so stressed and exhausted that I just took total control. I practically carried Tatum inside the room and sat her down on this little plastic chair right by the front door. I turned around and practically begged the guys to pack up their beers and get upstairs to the loft right now because Tatum was sick, even bribing them by promising I would wash all their dirty dishes the next morning if they just cleared out. While they were stumbling around gathering their trash, I ran up the wooden stairs to grab some thick blankets for us to sleep on the floor downstairs. I was up there for maybe 30 seconds. I had just gathered a pile of pillows into my arms when I heard her cousin scream my name from the bottom of the stairs. He sounded absolutely terrified. I dropped everything and practically fell down the wooden steps. I skidded to a halt right at the doorway, and all the air just completely left my lungs. Tatum was no longer sitting on the plastic chair. She was squatting on the dirty tile floor right at the threshold of the door, but she was facing inward toward the room, with her back to the dark street outside, and the way she was sitting was just so completely biologically wrong for her. She was squatting on the floor, man-spreading so wide it felt completely vulgar and violating, resting her forearms heavily on knees while her head tilted at this awful, unnatural angle that looked incredibly painful. I saw that her right hand was gripping a cheap plastic lighter, and her left hand was holding a cigarette that she had clearly dug out of the boys' trash pile. Before my brain could even process what the actual fuck was happening, she slowly brought the cigarette up to her lips, without even looking at me, while her glassy eyes rolled halfway back into her skull, sparking the lighter and inhaling so aggressively that the glowing cherry burned through half the cigarette in one single sickening pull, as the paper crackled loudly in the absolute silence of the room. The frat boys were practically climbing over each other to hide in the back bathroom, leaving me completely alone with whatever was wearing my best friend's body. I took a tiny step forward and called her name, asking her what was wrong with her. She slowly snapped her neck to look at me, her face contorted into this ugly, arrogant sneer that I had never seen in my entire life. "Who the fuck is Tatum?" The voice rasped out of my best friend's throat, but it sounded so hollow and aggressive and deep it made my skin completely crawl. She sat there, swaying slightly, flicking the lighter with a twitchy hand while she glared at me with lifeless, empty eyes. "I am Dax. You make sure you call me Dax. Got it?" My brain completely short-circuited. Holy shust, we were hours away from anyone I knew, and the guys in the back were entirely useless. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed the number of an older spiritual mentor I knew back in Saigon, who was heavily involved in temple rituals. The phone rang 3 times before she groggily answered. I whispered into the receiver that my friend was possessed and sitting right in front of me. I explained everything in a total panic. The psychic lady immediately woke up, told me to put the phone on speaker, and I could literally hear the sound of her frantic, rushing footsteps over the line as she ran down to her altar room. She told me to place the phone as close to Tatum as possible. I crept forward, my hands shaking violently, and slid the phone across the tiles until it stopped a few feet from Tatum's boots. The entity calling itself Dax didn't even look down. It just kept staring at the ceiling, completely ignoring me like a cocky teenager. The spiritual mentor on the phone started chanting. It was this ancient, heavy, rhythmic string of syllables that vibrated through the tiny phone speaker. It was a very specific protective Buddhist mantra meant to crush malicious energy. She told me to repeat the words after her, so I started stammering out the heavy syllables, my voice cracking with pure fear. At first, Dax just scoffed. The entity used Tatum's mouth to laugh this dry, rattling chuckle and mocked us, saying we were wasting our time with stupid noises. It took another massive drag, burning the cigarette down to the filter, and then snapped its fingers, flicking the butt aggressively into the street outside. It is weird the details your brain holds onto, but from the moment I found her sitting there to the moment it left, that thing only ever lit a cigarette exactly 6 times. It immediately snatched another one from the pile and lit it. But as the chanting went on, that arrogant posture completely vanished, and Tatum's hand started shaking so violently she could barely hold the lighter. It took a frantic drag, tossed the cigarette after 2 seconds, grabbed another one, lit it, and threw it away. She burned through her final 2 drags out of those 6 total times in less than 10 seconds, completely losing her mind in a state of sheer panic. Suddenly, Tatum's body shot straight up from the floor. I screamed and scrambled backward against the wall. The entity ignored me and marched directly over to the bottom of the staircase. It dropped heavily onto the floor, curling up on its side and throwing Tatum's arm under her head like a makeshift pillow. "I'm leaving now," the deep voice practically yelled, though it sounded incredibly strained and weak. "I was just visiting for a bit. Stop with the fucking chanting. I am sleeping right here." And then, just like that, Tatum's eyes rolled shut and her body went completely limp. The crushing, freezing pressure in the room vanished almost instantly. I stayed glued to the wall, immediately picking up the phone to desperately update the older lady. I told her the entity just laid down by the stairs and said it was leaving. For the next 5 agonizing minutes, she stayed on the line with me, confirming that the chant must have worked and telling me to just observe her closely. Only when the air finally felt normal again and the spiritual mentor told me to hang up and call back if anything else happened, did I creep over and shake Tatum's shoulder. She gasped, and her eyes shot open. She looked around the room in pure confusion, asking me why her mouth tasted like an ashtray and how she ended up sleeping on the cold floor by the stairs. She had zero memory of anything that happened after we left the hotel. While the boys finally crawled out of the bathroom to give her water, Tatum sat on the floor and rubbed her temples, finally confessing what she actually saw back in room 313. She told me that when I turned off the light the first time, she saw a gray-faced man in a loud button-up shirt and a dirty baseball cap squatting on the balcony, his naturally huge eyes bulging so wide open they looked like they were going to pop out of his skull, staring right through the glass at her. And when I turned the light off the second time, he wasn't on the balcony anymore. He was squatting inside the room, barely 2 feet away from the bed, with those same disproportionately massive eyes, practically unblinking, staring directly into her face. Because I am someone who deeply believes in the spiritual world, I always wear a blessed red string bracelet that I got from a temple back home. Thinking back on it, I realized that was exactly why the entity didn't target me, and exactly why it couldn't fully possess Tatum in the car. I was sitting right next to her in the back seat, so the aura of my bracelet was holding it back, forcing it to just physically weigh her shoulders down. It had to wait patiently, following us all the way back, for that one perfect, vulnerable moment when I ran upstairs and left her completely alone by the door. By that point, any concept of personal space or gender boundaries was completely thrown out the window. Nobody was sleeping in a separate room. We dragged every single blanket and pillow downstairs, and all 6 of us, the 4 guys and us 2 girls, slept lined up in a tight row right there on the tile floor. I made sure I was the one lying on the very outside edge near the door, keeping Tatum sandwiched safely in the middle. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, we drove straight to the massive Bodhisattva statue sitting right in the middle of Tanan City. Tatum finally stood up from the giant incense burner, wiping a bit of sweat from her forehead. She looked at me, let out this long breath, and told me she finally felt light again, confessing that she could feel that thing hovering right over her shoulder the entire night, while we were all lined up on the floor. I just nodded, and looked up at the massive statue above us. I wanted to tell her it was all over, that we were safe now, but looking back down at Tatum's pale face, I just couldn't get the words out. I just stood there. Through the frosted glass of the bathroom door, I could see this twisted shadow of a girl with long, stringy hair hunched over the sink, vigorously brushing her teeth. The thing is, the shadow's arm was moving back and forth so frantically and aggressively, almost like she was trying to scrub her own teeth right out of her mangled gums, and she had been doing it non-stop for over 3 minutes. I finally got super annoyed and told her through the door to hurry up so I could take a piss, only for a tired voice from the bed directly behind me to casually mention that nobody was in the bathroom. To understand how trapped and sick to my stomach I felt right then, you really have to know I was just a sophomore on a broke college field trip in Hue back in 2018. I go to this over 100-year-old fine arts university down in Ho Chi Minh City. The campus itself is basically this ancient heritage mansion that locals swear is insanely haunted by the original wealthy owners. So we are somewhat used to creepy atmospheres, but our program constantly ships us out to these historical provinces for sketching and video assignments. And this specific trip was a grueling month-long tour where we hit Phan Thiet, Nha Trang, Da Lat, Hoi An, and finally Hue, only staying 1 night at each location. It honestly felt less like an educational trip and more like a brutal tour guide internship where we were just being worked to the absolute bone, which is probably why we were all so lethargic and checked out. Hue is this incredibly sad, ancient imperial city right in the middle of Vietnam, and everyone knows it is heavily saturated in tragic history. People in the South always talk about how haunted the highlands are, but honestly, the paranormal energy in Hue is way worse, just incredibly heavy and aggressive. Because the university budget was basically non-existent, they booked us into this absolute dump of a motel masquerading as a decent hotel. It probably cost them maybe 10 or 15 bucks a night per room. They took all 14 of us students and split us down the middle, meaning 7 of us girls were shoved into a single, suffocating room. We were told it was a triple room, which usually implies 3 large beds, but when we unlocked the door, it was just 3 tiny twin beds, squeezed together in the center of the floor. It was cramped, sweaty, and just a miserable setup with zero air conditioning, just a dusty ceiling fan rattling overhead. But honestly, despite how claustrophobic it was actually kind of fun in that chaotic, messy college sleepover bonding way. It was a little past 8:15 p.m., and we were all lying on our stomachs on that giant makeshift mattress, our heads huddled together in the middle as we tried to finish our sketching homework after a long, exhausting day of visiting the ancient imperial city and the Kai Din tomb. It was completely dead silent in the room, but I did not pay attention to my surroundings anyway because I was just too focused on my assignment. I was staring intensely down at my notebook, scribbling away without even lifting my head to look around the room for what felt like hours. I was so hyper-focused on finding the right descriptive words for the imperial architecture that I did not even realize my friend Harper had quietly gotten up. She had slipped out of our room to go next door to borrow some pens from the guys in our class. About 2 or 3 minutes after she supposedly left, my bladder started acting up and I really needed to take a piss. I crawled out of the bed so carefully, trying my absolute best not to make a single sound because I did not want to break everyone's concentration. The bathroom was attached right inside our room, literally just a few steps away from the edge of the mattress. I walked over and grabbed the cold metal doorknob. Wait, no, it was one of those cheap plastic ones with the weird little grip ridges on it, and I gave it a twist. It gave this heavy metallic click but refused to turn. It was locked from the inside. That is when I looked up at the frosted glass panel, taking up the top half of the bathroom door. I could clearly see the blurry silhouette of someone in there. The shadow was hunched over the sink area, and the arms were moving in this aggressive back and forth motion, making this gross, wet swishing noise like someone aggressively rinsing their mouth and spitting. I instantly did the math in my head. I literally counted the bodies on the mattress behind me out loud in my brain. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there is Hannah, Paige, Haley. I counted 5 girls lying down, plus me standing there making 6. We had 7 girls in our group. So simple logic told me that Harper had to be the one inside the bathroom. I even mentally complained to myself about why she was doing her nighttime routine so early. We had all literally just agreed to go down to the street market to grab some late-night roasted pork and sweet soup around 10:30 p.m. It made absolutely zero sense to brush your teeth right now just to go eat greasy street food in a couple of hours and have to brush them all over again. I just stood there shifting my weight from foot to foot, waiting for her to finish so I could take a leak. But the shadow just did not stop. The arm kept thrusting back and forth in this chaotic, violent rhythm against the frosted glass, and the silhouette of the head was bobbing up and down in this incredibly unnatural, jerky way. It literally looked like whoever was in there was trying to violently scrub their jaw clean off their face. I stood there, watching this freaky non-stop movement for a solid 3 minutes, and the sheer speed of the shadow was starting to make my eyes hurt. The wet, rhythmic swishing sound was echoing weirdly against the bathroom tiles. I finally could not hold my bladder in anymore, and I softly called out to Harper to wrap it up and let me in because she was taking way too freaking long, and I really needed to go. As soon as the words left my mouth, one of the girls lying on the bed behind me, specifically the one who had literally just been lying right next to Harper's empty spot and knew exactly where she went, groaned and told me I was being an idiot because Harper had already left to go to the boys' room and the bathroom was completely empty. I completely brushed off her comment because I thought they were just messing with me. I turned around, literally pointed my finger right at the frosted glass, and argued back that she was standing right there brushing her teeth, and they just could not see her shadow from their low angle on the bed. Right at that exact second, the heavy wooden door to our motel room clicked and swung open from the main hallway. Harper casually walked inside holding a bunch of pens and sketch pads she had just borrowed. If Harper was standing right there next to the front door, looking at me like I was a crazy person, then who the hell had I been watching behind that frosted glass for the last 5 minutes? I slowly snapped my neck back around to look at the bathroom door. The exact second my eyes locked onto the frosted glass, the light inside the bathroom violently snapped off, plunging the small space behind the door into pitch blackness. The frantic brushing shadow completely vanished into the dark. I was just standing there, paralyzed, my brain desperately trying to rationalize the absolute bullshit I was seeing, when the plastic doorknob suddenly gave a sharp, metallic click. Here is the thing that really messed with my head. That bathroom door was an inward opening system. It swung directly into the tight space in front of the sink. If someone was actually standing right there, the heavy door would have physically smashed right into them, forcing them to step back. But instead, the door just creaked inward super slow, pulling away from the frame and opening up into a dark, hollow, and perfectly empty tiled room. There was no one in there. There was no wet toothbrush on the counter. The sink was bone dry. It was just a terrifying heavy void staring back at me. I lost my absolute fucking mind. I let out this ear-piercing scream and leaped backward off the floor, launching my entire body onto the bed and basically crushing two of my friends in the process. I ripped the heavy blanket over my head, buried my face in the pillows, and just started bawling my eyes out like a literal toddler. The second I screamed, everyone else just lost it, shrieking and scrambling over each other in total confusion and terror. It was absolute chaos in that tiny room. Someone grabbed my wrist and aggressively yanked me off the mattress, dragging me out of the room, into the brightly lit hallway, and straight into the boys' room next door. Now, you have to understand, we were just naive underclassmen, and there is this huge unspoken rule about guys and girls keeping their physical distance in our culture. So normally we would not be caught dead crashing in the guys' room. But in that moment, all of that traditional modesty completely went out the window. We were making so much noise that one of our university instructors actually ran upstairs to chew us out for disturbing the peace and ruining the study session. I was crying so hard and shaking so violently that I could barely string a sentence together while I explained the violently brushing shadow and the door opening on its own into the pitch-black bathroom. Every single girl in my group was terrified of the dark anyway, so hearing that just broke them. None of us were willing to step a single foot back into that cursed room for the rest of the night. We basically hijacked the boys' room, forcing all the guys to throw their blankets on the hard floor to sleep, while the 7 of us squeezed onto their beds, staying wide awake until the sun finally came up. Luckily, since we were in college, the rules were way more relaxed than back in high school, so we knew there were no strict curfews or random midnight bed checks from the professors anyway. The next morning, we had a really tight schedule and had to pack up quickly to check out and get on the road. One of the girls from our group, not Harper but someone else, completely forgot about the paranormal nightmare from the night before because she was so incredibly focused on rushing to pack her bags. She ran back into our original room to grab her scattered clothes and decided to use the bathroom really quick before we boarded the bus. Less than a minute later, we heard this bone-chilling shriek. She came sprinting out of that room, sobbing hysterically, completely pale, and covering her face with her hands like she had just witnessed a brutal murder. We were already so paranoid from the night before that we instantly started chewing her out. Someone angrily yelled at her, asking what the actual fuck she was thinking going in there when we already established the bathroom was haunted, and demanded to know if she was out of her damn mind and why she did not just go use the guy's shedder down the hall. She was just hyperventilating and bawling, crying out that she had just completely forgotten about the ghost in her frantic rush to pack her bags. We did not even stop to ask any more questions. We just grabbed her arms, hauled her bags down the stairs, and sprinted straight to the tour bus waiting outside. Once the heavy bus doors closed and the engine started running, she finally stopped hyperventilating enough to tell us what she saw. She told us she just wanted to take a quick piss before the long drive, but when she lifted the toilet seat, she did not see any water. The entire bowl was choked with this massive, thick clump of incredibly long, pitch-black human hair. It was soaking wet, slimy, and tangled up like someone had just skinned a scalp and shoved the entire mass of hair down the drain. She said it was not just a little hairball from someone showering. It was a massive, rotting nest of hair just floating there, completely clogging the porcelain bowl. If I had not spoken up when I stood outside that bathroom door, we would have just brushed off the weird noises and slept in that room all night. That massive clump of hair in the toilet was physical proof that whatever was standing in there, aggressively scrubbing its teeth in the dark, was very real and physically occupying that space with us. Ever since that field trip to Hue, I literally cannot walk into any hotel bathroom without cautiously checking the toilet bowl first. And if a place has those frosted glass shower doors, I flat out refuse to sleep there. I will gladly sleep in my car. I just cannot do it anymore. My brain will always expect to see someone brushing their teeth in the dark, just waiting for me to turn off the lights. I woke up to the feeling of coarse sand stinging my face and the freezing ocean wind blasting right into my bones. I opened my eyes groggily, expecting to see the wooden ceiling of the resort patio where I fell asleep. Instead, there was just the open gray sky of 5 a.m. I looked around and my stomach completely dropped. I was lying right in the middle of the sandy pathway leading down to the beach, barely 40 feet away from the actual crashing ocean waves, a solid 160 feet away from the patio. The heavy blanket was still pulled all the way up to my chest, and my pillow was nestled perfectly under my head, exactly how I had arranged them when I fell asleep under that covered roof. Someone or something had carried me. My heavy folding chair, my blanket, and my pillow, all that way in the pitch black without making a single sound or waking me up even once. I just sat there frozen, with sand blowing onto my blanket, realizing I had just been physically moved by something I couldn't even see. But to make sense of how screwed up that morning was, I need to back up a bit. My name is Jenny, and I work as a freelance tour guide. I don't do the standard bus tours. I partner directly with high-end resorts, move in for a few months, and act as their local expert. So when I got a 6-month contract at this old French colonial-style 4-star resort on Fuquoc Island, I was pumped. It was one of the first resorts ever built on the island, maybe over a decade old. My contract was simple. I would stay on site and take guests out to explore Baisao Beach, go snorkeling out by the coral reefs, visit the Hoquoc Pagoda, and tour the old Fuquoc prison. A few days after moving in, I was grabbing a bowl of noodles at the local night market when the street vendor casually dropped a bomb on me. She told me the resort I was staying at had a body count. Look, you have to understand something about me. I've always been a massive tomboy. I keep my hair cut super short. I dress purely for utility. And I generally have the personality of a stubborn guy who does not scare easily. You kind of need that thick skin when you travel solo for a living. So when I am sitting there on this tiny plastic stool eating my dinner, I am not really in the mindset to entertain local ghost stories. I remember the noodle lady leaning over her steaming pot of broth and lowering her voice to tell me that the very ground my fancy new workplace was built on was basically a graveyard. She went on to explain that back in the early days of construction, there was a horrible accident where 3 construction workers dead all at once on the site. And according to her, those 3 guys were angry, so they started pulling other people down with them over the next couple of months. It got so bad that the entire multi-million-dollar project was completely abandoned for a solid year. She told me that during that abandoned year, the half-built resort became this dark magnet for every sketchy and tragic thing on the island. People going there to end their lives over broken hearts, underground gambling rings ending in fatal stabbings, just terrible things. She claimed that close to 20 people lost their lives on that exact plot of land before the construction finally resumed. I just wiped my mouth, handed her a 50,000 dong bill, which is like $2, and walked away thinking it was complete crap. Locals always have these dramatic urban legends about old colonial buildings to scare the tourists, but the next day, out of pure curiosity, I casually asked around the neighborhood, and every single person confirmed one specific detail. The construction of the resort had mysteriously stopped for an entire year, and nobody was allowed on the property during that time. That one verified detail was huge for me. Out of all the wild rumors about ghosts and stabbings, knowing for a fact that the resort was forced to shut down construction for over a year became this weird mental bridge. It was the one piece of solid truth that made me secretly question if there was more to those rumors than I wanted to admit. About 4 or 5 days into my stay, the atmosphere in that place started getting really heavy. The resort had an open-air design, meaning the hallways were exposed to the outside, so sound traveled incredibly well. I was staying in a small staff room on the ground floor. Every night, right around 2:15 a.m., I would hear these heavy, erratic footsteps echoing through the building. The silence would be absolutely suffocating until I heard this sudden, frantic running sound, almost like a group of guests who had just checked in running back and forth across the floorboards right above my ceiling, or little kids playing tag and chasing each other down the dark corridors. It was super annoying because the walls were paper thin. I pulled up the guest registry the next morning. I walked right up to the front desk and asked the receptionist how many people were actually staying in our wing, because I needed to know who to pitch my island tours to. She looked at her computer screen and told me there were only about 5 rooms booked in the entire massive property. I asked her who the heck was running around making all that racket last night, around, I think it was maybe 2:30 a.m., but she just looked at me totally confused. She swore to me that absolutely nobody had checked in the night before, and that the whole second floor was completely empty. I just brushed it off, assuming it was the security guards messing around, or maybe just the old wood settling in the sea breeze. But things escalated really fast later that same week. I was pissed because I signed a whole partnership contract with this resort, but they kept shoving me into the driver's lounge to sleep with no damn view at all. So I marched right up to the front desk and confronted the receptionist, telling her, "Look, I signed a contract to work here, but you guys keep sticking me in the driver's room with no damn view whatsoever. Give me one of those empty ocean view rooms for the night." They couldn't really argue with that, so they gave me the keys. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. As I was walking out of the bathroom and heading back to the bed, I heard this muffled sound of a crowd. It sounded like people laughing and playing, a constant overlapping chatter mixing with the sound of the ocean waves crashing right outside the window. I peeked through the window blinds, expecting to see some obnoxious VIP guests throwing a late-night beach party. There was a group of maybe 15 people out there on the sand, just messing around and throwing wet sand at each other in the dark. But the longer I squinted through the glass, the more my brain started to reject what I was looking at. Their clothes made absolutely zero sense together. A few of them were wearing dirty, ragged construction uniforms. Others were in stiff business shirts and jeans. Some were in bright beachwear, and the rest were in cheap everyday street clothes. It was like somebody took random people from completely different decades, from totally different social classes, and shoved them into one chaotic group on a dark beach. I actually rubbed my eyes hard, convincing myself I was just sleep-deprived from running tours in the hot sun all day. I stood right there at the window, staring out for a moment. Then I walked over and climbed into the hotel bed. I laid down, pulled the thick blanket right up to my chest, and looked out the window again from where I was lying. In less than 5 to 7 seconds, the beach was completely empty. There was no one running away, no voices fading into the distance, just the empty, dark sand. My heart started beating a little faster, but I refused to let it get to me. I was a rational adult, not some scared kid. By the time I hit my 13th night living on the property, it was a major holiday weekend, and suddenly the resort was fully booked. Every single room was taken. Because of the overflow, the only place left for me to sleep was the driver's lounge, which is basically a big communal room where all the male shuttle drivers crash between shifts. I took one look inside and saw a bunch of dudes chain smoking, talking loudly, and making a mess. I hated it. So I made a decision that I will regret for the rest of my life. I went to the storage closet, grabbed a heavy metal folding cot, and dragged it out to the edge of the property. There was this long covered patio area right next to the garden that eventually led down to the beach. It had these massive concrete pillars, each one so thick you couldn't even wrap your arms around it. The area had a solid roof. It was shielded from the wind, and guests never really went back there at night. It was the perfect spot to get some quiet sleep. Earlier that morning, because the resort was totally packed, I had personally rented a 16-seater van and driven a huge group of tourists all over the island to visit the pagodas and the prison. I was completely bone-tired from driving and managing people all day long, so I was ready to sleep like a log. I set up my cot, threw my blanket over myself, and passed out immediately. I was out cold until the temperature suddenly dropped. The air got so heavy it felt like breathing underwater, and then I heard that same slow, deliberate slapping sound, almost like wet bare feet dragging against the rough concrete floor right in front of my cot. And the worst part was I could hear it pacing back and forth in this tight little circle just inches away from where my head was resting. I sat up slightly, looking around in the dim yellow security light, but the patio was totally empty. Because I was naturally stubborn and didn't believe in any of that supernatural stuff, I didn't feel scared at all. I just laid right back down, pulled the blanket over myself, and tried to fall back asleep. But then I heard the voices. It was not a normal human conversation. It sounded distorted, rough, like it was echoing out of a deep tunnel, speaking in this really thick, gritty regional dialect. Who is this girl? This is where the brick materials are supposed to go. Why is she sleeping right here? How are we supposed to get any work done? My blood ran completely ice cold. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up without moving my head. Standing right by the base of one of those massive concrete pillars were 3 men. They were not resort staff, and they were definitely not tourists. They were wearing faded, filthy construction shirts that were completely torn and frayed at the shoulders. One guy was in a stained white shirt, another in a ripped blue shirt, and the third was shirtless with deeply tanned, leathery skin. They were huddled together, leaning over slightly, just staring down at my cot. I frantically looked around the patio floor. There were no bricks anywhere, no construction materials, no tools, nothing, just decorative resort plants and smooth, clean tile. In my exhausted head, I just thought, there aren't even any bricks here. These guys are talking complete nonsense. They can't possibly be talking to me. Honestly, I was so completely drained from driving that 16-seater van full of tourists around all day that my sheer physical exhaustion just won out over everything else. So instead of jumping up and screaming, I squeezed my eyes shut, pulled the blanket over my head, and completely ignored them. And that brings me right back to 5 a.m. the next morning. I didn't wake up naturally. The young receptionist was shaking my shoulder, waking me up, because a group of guests had just booked an early morning tour to the pagoda and the prison, and she needed to know if I could take the job. I sat up, still half asleep, and quickly confirmed the booking details with her. But as soon as we finished talking business, she looked around in absolute shock and asked why on earth I was sleeping out here right on the beach path. I was a full 160 feet away from that covered patio, dumped right on the exposed beach path, barely 40 feet from where the sea waves were crashing onto the shore. She was looking at me like I was a complete psychopath, asking me why I dragged my heavy bed out to the freezing beach to sleep, and warning me that the early morning guests would complain. I was so disoriented I actually snapped at her, telling her I went to sleep under the patio roof. Then I looked at the massive distance between me and the patio, and then down at my position, sitting just a dozen meters away from the ocean water. I looked at my heavy metal folding chair, my thick blanket still pulled all the way up to my chest, my pillows. Everything was in the exact same state, utterly untouched, as if I had just laid down right there. Someone, or a group of someones, had physically lifted my entire setup, with my dead weight on it, carried it over 150 feet across the property in total silence, and dropped me right on the sand. I didn't feel a single fucking thing. I stumbled back into the lobby, shivering uncontrollably, feeling absolutely sick to my stomach. I grabbed the receptionist and demanded to know if the hotel was doing any secret renovations or had any local construction workers on site. She swore up and down that there was absolutely no construction going on. I described the 3 men to her perfectly. The white shirt, the blue shirt, the tanned shirtless guy, and how they were angry about me sleeping on their building materials. All the color drained from the receptionist's face. She lowered her voice and looked me right in the eyes. She told me to believe it, because it was 100% true. Her house was right there on the island, and when that accident happened, she was only 6 or 7 years old. She was 18 or 19 now, so that was roughly 12 or 13 years ago. She explained that back when the resort was first being built, all the materials had to be shipped on boats from the mainland, so the construction workers lived right on the site. One night, 3 workers got completely wasted while building a set of new concrete stairs up to the 2nd floor. The stairwell was completely raw without any handrails or safety barriers yet, and they ended up slipping and falling right off the open edge, cracking their skulls open right on the pavement and dropping Dad right then and there in a pool of blood. After that, she said they started dragging other workers down with them. Some guys inexplicably broke their arms and legs in freak accidents, while others were straight up pushed off the upper levels by invisible forces until they died. That was why the site was completely abandoned for a year. I just stood there in the lobby, letting the reality wash over me. I didn't say another word to the receptionist. I just walked straight to my room, packed my bags in absolute silence, and tore up my 6-month contract. By 3 p.m. that same afternoon, I was on a boat back to the mainland, just staring at the water, realizing how incredibly lucky I was that they only decided to carry me to the beach. I was literally screaming her name into the pitch-black night, stumbling over the sand, trying to apologize for snapping at her, but she just kept walking straight into the ocean. The crazy part wasn't that she was ignoring me. It was the fact that she was easily 50 yards out into the pitch-black water, but her bare feet and the hem of her white dress were completely dry. She wasn't wading through the waves. She was gliding right on top of them. My stomach just dropped to my knees, because I realized whoever the hell I was following, it wasn't my cousin. I need to backtrack. This happened a few years ago when my massive extended family decided to rent out an entire cheap motel for a weekend getaway at this coastal town. We had actually chartered 2 massive 50-seater buses for this trip. Out of the 100 or so people who went, I would say at least 85% of them were older folks like aunts, uncles, and grandparents. This wasn't some professionally organized tour either. It was totally self-funded. The relatives literally just pooled money together and sold makeshift tickets to everyone in the extended family to cover the costs. There were barely anyone my age, so I wasn't in the mood for the heavy partying. When we first arrived in the afternoon, the adults had divided up all the rooms, assigning couples and pairing us off strictly into groups of 2 or 3. I decided to crash in my room early. I was sharing a ground floor room with my older cousin, Tara. The room was literally like 30 yards from where the sand met the ocean. It was super basic, just a thin sliding glass door separating our beds from the dark beach outside. Tara wanted to hit up a local night market for some street food, but I just wanted to lay in bed with the lights blaring, listening to my cheap little red MP3 player to drown out the noise of our relatives screaming over their card games outside. The place we went to was this area called Koh Thatch, right past Fentheet. It is known for having a lot of spiritual temples nearby, so older people love taking these massive pilgrimage trips down there. My Uncle Tommy had actually called ahead and booked the entire motel for our family starting from Saturday noon, meaning there were absolutely 0 outside guests on the property. Every single person in that courtyard was blood related to me, or married into the family. They were all sitting on plastic chairs right outside my door, clinking beer glasses and shouting cheers while playing some complicated traditional card games. It is this huge cultural thing back home where adults absolutely love gambling and playing cards on vacations. But because it is technically illegal and they are paranoid about the cops busting them, they always hide out in the enclosed motel courtyards to do it. I was just lying there on the bright white hotel bed sheets. I had this tiny bright red knockoff MP3 player, the kind that is no bigger than your thumb and only holds a few dozen songs. I had my cheap wired earbuds shoved deep into my ears, blasting some old pop songs, but the audio quality was so garbage, I could still hear my uncles yelling outside. I think it was maybe around 8:15 p.m. or something close to that. The room lights were completely on because I was too lazy to get up and hit the switch. That was when I heard the first knock. It was a very deliberate tapping sound coming from the glass sliding door that faced the beach. Just a quick tap, tap, tap that cut right through the music in my ears. I rolled over and looked through the thin gap in the curtains. I could see the silhouette of a girl standing right outside my door on the patio area. She had long dark hair, and she was wearing a bright white dress, which made total sense because Tara had put on a white sundress right before she said she was going out. You know how it is, girls always pack those flowy white dresses for beach trips, specifically to take aesthetic photos by the water, so seeing someone dressed like that did not raise any red flags for me at all. But the weird thing was, she was standing with her back completely facing the glass door. She was just staring out into the pitch black ocean. I remember thinking it was so stupid to knock on a door and then turn your back to it. I pulled out one of my earbuds and yelled through the glass that I was feeling sick and I was not going to the night market with her. I just assumed she was trying to guilt trip me into going. I shoved the earbud back in and closed my eyes. When I peeked again a few seconds later, she was just gone. She must have walked off toward the street. About 20 minutes passed. I was finally starting to drift off, feeling the nausea from the bus ride fading away. Then the tapping sound came back. It was a bit louder this time, a sharp metallic click against the aluminum frame of the sliding door. I let out a heavy sigh and sat up. I looked through the glass and there she was again, standing in the exact same spot, wearing the exact same white dress, and her back was still turned to me, facing the dark water. Now I was just getting annoyed. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and slipped my feet into my sandals, muttering under my breath about how clingy she was being. I walked up to the door and grabbed the handle, but before I could even slide it open, I saw her figure just casually walk away, stepping off the patio and disappearing into the shadows toward the beach. I stood there for a second feeling completely confused. I actually debated following her to tell her off, but my stomach was still doing flips, so I just locked the door and went back to my bed. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I cranked the volume up on my little red MP3 player until it was practically buzzing in my ears. I was just staring at the ceiling, trying to focus on the lyrics. Then it happened a third time. I don't know the exact time, but I was guessing it had to be somewhere past 9 o'clock already. The knock was aggressive this time, like a heavy thud against the glass. I was so freaking pissed off that I ripped the earphones out of my ears and aggressively threw the bright red MP3 player right onto the stark white bed sheets. I did not even bother putting my shoes on properly. I practically threw the sliding door open and marched outside into the humid, salty air. By the time I stepped out, she was already about 10 feet away from me, walking slowly toward the ocean. I called out to Tara, telling her to stop acting like a child and explaining again that my motion sickness was killing me. I just kept rambling, trying to justify why I did not want to hang out. When she completely ignored me, I just gave in. I started practically pleading with her, yelling that I would go to the night market. I would go eat whatever she wanted. Just please turn around and come back inside. But she did not even turn her head. She just kept walking with this slow, rhythmic pace, her white dress catching the faint ambient light from the motel courtyard behind us. I started following her, my bare feet sinking into the cool sand. I kept calling her name, asking her where the hell she thought she was going because there was absolutely nothing out there. The beach at Kothach at night is incredibly dark. There are no city lights reflecting off the water. If there are no waves crashing to create white foam, you literally cannot see the boundary where the sand ends and the ocean begins. It is just a massive wall of black nothingness. I followed her until I hit this cluster of large rocks on the beach. There was a concrete bench nearby, and I stopped there because the sand was getting wet and sticky. I looked ahead, expecting to see her stop at the water line. That was when my brain simply stopped processing reality. She was easily 50 yards out from where I was standing. That meant she was way past the shoreline. She was deep into the ocean zone. But as I squinted into the darkness, I could see the bottom of her feet. The hem of her white dress was perfectly dry, fluttering slightly in the wind. She was not wading through waist-deep water. She was walking on top of the black ocean. Her feet were hovering inches above the surface, gliding forward into the absolute void. My legs felt like heavy bags of wet sand, and my throat locked up so tight I couldn't even breathe. I grabbed onto the freezing stone bench, my whole body trembling violently. My brain just completely broke down. Holy fuck, that was not my cousin. I was standing there hyperventilating, watching this dead girl in a white dress glide across the surface of the black ocean until she melted into the night. I spun around and just started walking fast back toward the motel courtyard, completely shaken. I went back inside the gates, and everything was just ridiculously normal. The room lights were still blazing. Outside in the courtyard, my uncles were still slamming cards on the plastic tables, laughing loudly. Stepping back into that courtyard with everyone still screaming over their card games felt completely surreal, like my brain couldn't bridge the gap between what I just saw out in the water and my uncles laughing 50 feet away. I was taking a few steps toward the courtyard, planning to go tell my parents and relatives what I just saw, when my cousin Tara walked in through the front gate. She was carrying 2 plastic bags full of sliced guava and sugarcane snacks. She had just come back from the street market. I grabbed her arm the second she walked into our room. I was shaking so badly I could barely form a coherent sentence. I desperately explained every single thing that just happened. The knocking, the white dress, the chase, the floating over the water. Tara's face went completely pale. She dropped the bags of fruit on the table and told me we were packing our stuff right now. She was terrified that the spirit had mimicked her appearance to lure me out into the deep water. I actually had to stop her and clarify that it wasn't even mimicking her. I told her that when I really pictured it, the thing standing outside our door was noticeably taller than she was. It was just a completely messed up coincidence that they were both wearing white dresses, and looking at it from behind, my brain just automatically assumed it was her. We started throwing all our clothes into our duffel bags, intending to go crash on the floor of my parents' room. That was when I realized something was wrong. I looked at the bright white bed sheets. My red MP3 player was gone. I tore the blankets apart, checked under the pillows, checked under the bed. It was completely missing. I distinctly remembered angrily throwing it right in the middle of the white mattress before I chased the girl outside. It was a bright red object on a stark white background. It was impossible to miss. Tara tried to lighten the mood with a nervous laugh, saying maybe the ghost stole it and threw it in the ocean. I remember telling her I didn't even care about the cheap player itself, but losing the little memory card inside it really sucked. Back then, it was a massive pain to manually download and transfer all those specific songs onto an SD card, and I was so annoyed about losing my playlist. But we were too scared to stay in that room to keep looking. Since our family funded the whole trip and we had the entire property to ourselves, nobody cared about standard room capacities. We just grabbed our bags, walked into another room with our relatives, laid some thin mats on the floor, and crammed like 7 people into a space meant for 3. We spent the entire night wide awake, huddled together. The next morning, the sun was shining, the sky was blue, and everything felt ridiculously normal. My family was sitting out in the courtyard eating breakfast noodles. A few of the older uncles are early risers, and they love swimming in the ocean at the crack of dawn. Uncle Tommy came walking up from the beach, dripping wet, holding a towel. In his right hand, he was holding a tiny bright red electronic device with white earphones dangling from it. He held it up and loudly asked the courtyard who was stupid enough to drop their music player in the ocean. I stopped chewing my food. Tara and I slowly turned to look at him. I asked him where exactly he found it. Uncle Tommy laughed and said he was swimming way out in the deep water, treading and diving, when he felt something plastic bump against his chest. He said it was floating incredibly far from the shore. All the blood drained from my face. I never took that MP3 player out of the room. I left it on the bed. Somehow, that thing in the white dress had walked into my room, taken my bright red music player, and carried it 50 yards out into the pitch-black ocean, just to drop it in the water. Tara's nervous joke from the night before was actually the terrifying truth. We ended up telling the whole story to the group, and the motel landlady overheard us. She did not act surprised at all. She actually looked incredibly exhausted. She sat down at our table and quietly told us the history of the place. She explained that a few years ago, A local girl from the village had gotten her heart broken by some guy. The girl was born in a coastal town, but she never learned how to swim. One night, she just walked straight into the ocean and drowned herself. She wasn't even acting like some solemn grieving saint either. She was openly venting, complaining about how bullshit the whole situation was. She said the girl killed herself over some stupid heartbreak, and out of all the places along the coastline, the ocean currents had to drag her bloated, waterlogged body right onto the sand directly in front of her motel. Having a dead corpse wash up on your doorstep ruined her business overnight, scaring away every single paying customer. She felt so bad for the girl's poor family that she actually gave them a few million dong, which is roughly like a couple $100, to help pay for a proper funeral. Back then, this beach was incredibly popular, so the landlady was actually quite wealthy from running a fully booked motel. Handing over that kind of cash was not a big deal for her, but she still felt completely trapped by the situation. But the funeral did not make the girl leave. The landlady explained that the spirit just lingered on that specific stretch of the beach, constantly messing with tourists, knocking on glass doors, and luring people toward the water. To keep the ghost calm, the landlady had to sneak out to the beach 2 or 3 times a day, whenever guests were not looking, to burn incense and offer prayers. She said if she ever missed a day, the girl in the white dress would come back and terrorize whoever was staying in the ground floor rooms. She looked so defeated, saying she was just trapped, dealing with this ghost, because the girl's family was already grieving and there was nothing else she could do. We kept going back to that same coastal town for the next few years because it was a family tradition. Because she made so much money over the years, the landlady actually ended up tearing down that cheap motel and building a really nice, modern hotel on the exact same spot. I never stepped foot in that specific ground floor room ever again, though. On our 4th year back, we actually ran into the landlady and asked her about the girl. She looked almost relieved. She told us that ever since our massive family trip, the ghost just stopped showing up. She said she even tested it by not burning incense for a whole week, and nothing happened. She figured the girl finally moved on. I nodded and smiled like it was good news, but all I could think about was my red MP3 player. It didn't wash up naturally. Something dragged my music out of a locked room and dropped it in the middle of the dark ocean. And even if she's gone now, I still can't look at the water at night without feeling sick. The heavy comforter dragged against the wooden bed frame, making this awful, continuous scraping noise that just grated against my ears right as 2 pitch-black hands violently jerked the fabric off my boss's feet in the dim glow of the nightlight. He gripped the sheet for dear life, staring right at a solid, dark silhouette hovering at the edge of his mattress, completely paralyzed. I sat up on my side of the room, my skin crawling, realizing whatever was in that room had been watching us since the second we unlocked the door. I mean, to understand why the hell 2 grown men were huddled together on a single twin bed like terrified kids at 2 in the morning, you have to go back to the summer of 2020. I was a 21-year-old junior intern, totally clueless. Honestly, Marcus didn't even make me do any actual heavy accounting or specialized work at the office. He just really liked having me around. We mostly just took coffee breaks and smoked cigarettes together. So he invited me on this business trip down to Travaine, just so he wouldn't be bored out of his mind on the drive. We checked into this sleek hotel, and I was so out of my element. Growing up, whenever my family went out of town, we always crashed at some relatives' or family friends' houses. So at 21, I'd literally never stayed in a hotel before in my entire life. While we were standing at the front desk, Marcus handed over his ID, and the receptionist handed him back this plastic key card that looked exactly like a standard ATM or Visa card. I remember standing there, completely naive, thinking to myself about how weird it was. I wondered why the hotel was giving my boss a bank card instead of us handing them a card to pay for the room. That's how incredibly green I was. Marcus tossed the card to me and told me to head up to the 6th floor and open the door first so he could reverse his car and park it tight against the curb before the cops tried to ticket him. I just stared blankly at the plastic card in my hands, totally lost, until he sighed and explained that I just needed to swipe the magnetic strip on the lock, wait for it to beep green, and push the door open. So I hauled our bags up to the 6th floor, but when I stepped into our pitch-black room, I started toggling the wall switch over and over with a hollow clack-clack, completely unaware that you had to actually slot the keycard into the wall box to activate the room's power. As I was blindly feeling along the wall searching for a circuit breaker, a deep, gravelly male voice suddenly cut through the silence, spitting the words out incredibly fast right next to my ear. "Looking for something?" I froze, dropping my hand from the wall. I honestly just figured Marcus must have found a parking spot super fast and came up the elevator behind me. I immediately shrunk down, feeling super flustered and intimidated. I stammered back into the darkness, practically tripping over my own words, trying to politely tell my boss that yes, I was just looking for the switch because I couldn't find a way to turn the lights on for him. Silence. There wasn't any answer. Just the heavy, stale air of a hotel room that felt like it'd been sealed shut for weeks. I stood there in the pitch black for maybe 30 seconds, just waiting for him to say something. My pupils slowly started dilating, trying to pull in whatever tiny bits of ambient light were bleeding through the crack under the hallway door. And as my eyes adjusted, the layout of the room started to take shape. I could see the outline of 2 twin beds, and that's when I saw it. There was a man standing right at the corner of the left bed, but it wasn't Marcus. It was just a silhouette, but the physics of it were completely wrong. It was darker than the shadows around it, like a dense, solid hole cut right out of the room. I still didn't fully process what I was looking at, because my brain was trying to rationalize it. I actually asked the shape if it knew how to turn the power on, thinking maybe it was a maintenance guy or something bizarre. Right as the words left my mouth, I heard the elevator chime a sharp ding out in the hallway. Our room was located immediately next to the elevators. I heard heavy footsteps, and then Marcus walked through the open doorway behind me, loudly complaining about how insanely hot it was and asking why I hadn't turned the AC on yet. My stomach dropped to the floor. If Marcus was just now walking into the room from the hallway, then who the hell was standing by the bed? I snapped my head back toward the left corner. Nothing. The corner was totally empty. I just stood there staring at that completely empty spot by the mattress, feeling this heavy, suffocating chill hanging right over that exact corner where the guy was just standing seconds ago. Marcus shoved past me, snatched the plastic keycard from my sweaty hand, and physically demonstrated it to me like I was a complete dunce. He aggressively jammed the card into the wall slot and snapped at me, asking for fuck's sake how clueless I could possibly be. He pointed right at the little plastic box and mockingly told me to watch closely how you just slide the damn thing in right there, and then you just flip the switch, and boom, the lights come on. I just stood there, clutching my heavy duffel bag, completely dumbfounded. I really wanted to tell him about the voice and the shadow. I desperately wanted to. But Marcus was this incredibly strict, no-nonsense business guy who absolutely hated ghost stories. He always preached that talking about spirits or believing in bad omens would sabotage our business deals. Plus, he was already annoyed about the heat. I knew if I opened my mouth, he'd think I was either losing my mind or making up crap to annoy him. So I bit my tongue. But I'm not stupid. I knew for a fact that the shadow thing was standing right next to the left bed. Our room had 2 single beds separated by a massive gap, probably almost 2 meters wide. I immediately threw my bags onto the right bed, the one pressed safely against the far wall, and basically claimed it like a feral animal. Marcus looked at me like I was insane. He demanded to know why I was acting like a weirdo hoarding the bed. I just fed him some bullshit lie about having a weird habit of needing to sleep against a wall. He rolled his eyes, muttered something about me being a bizarre kid, and told me he didn't care as long as we both got some sleep. We unpacked our stuff, put our things away, and headed down to grab some dinner in Travin. I mean, there isn't a whole lot of nightlife down there. We just sat at a local outdoor cafe, drank some iced coffee, smoked a few cigarettes, and talked about work. We headed back up to the room around 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Marcus busted out his laptop on the small desk to review some client files, and I just laid on my designated safe bed, doom scrolling on my phone until my eyes got heavy. We eventually killed the main overhead lights around 11, leaving just this dim amber nightlight glowing near the bathroom door. I buried my face in the pillows and fell asleep pretty fast. Fast forward into the deepest part of the night. I've got no idea what time it was. I was violently jolted awake by Marcus, aggressively whispering my name. He sounded seriously pissed. He told me to quit messing around because we had an early morning and demanded to know why I kept yanking on his blanket. I was so groggy and confused. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, and told him I was literally wrapped up on my side of the room and hadn't touched him or his bed. He snapped back, his voice rising in panic, pointing out that there were only 2 of us in the freaking room, so I had to be the one pulling it. Then he raised a shaking finger and told me to look at the floor. I squinted through the dim yellowish light, and my blood ran absolutely cold. His thick, heavy hotel comforter wasn't just pulled off the mattress. It was practically launched across the room, crumpled up all the way over by the heavy wooden door at the entrance. There was zero physical way a blanket just flings itself that far across the room on its own. I slowly got out of bed, my knees feeling like absolute jelly. I walked over to the door, picked up the heavy blanket, and carried it back to him. I handed it over and swore up and down, practically begging him to believe me, that I absolutely didn't do it. Marcus didn't say a single word. He just darted his eyes wildly around the dark corners of the room, looking visibly rattled. I crawled back into my bed, but there was no way in hell I was falling back asleep. I pulled my own blanket all the way up to my chin, gripping the edges tight with both hands, and held my body completely rigid against the mattress. I was absolutely terrified that whatever just messed with Marcus was going to cross the room and try to yank my blanket next. I lay there for about 45 agonizing minutes, staring blankly at the ceiling, just darting my eyes around, freaking out over every little shape shifting in the dark, listening to the low hum of the AC unit. And you know, the thing that still messes with my head the most is that whatever was in that room with us didn't even look my way or try to mess with my blanket at all, because it was just completely, obsessively fixated on that left bed the entire time. And Marcus, despite being terrified, somehow managed to calm his breathing and started snoring heavily about 30 minutes later. I lay there in the dark, still gripping my blanket so tight my knuckles ached, just praying for the sun to come up. Just about 15 minutes after he started snoring, right as I was finally starting to drift off, I felt my mattress violently shift. The metal springs groaned loudly. Someone was crawling onto my bed. Oh shit. Oh fuck. My heart exploded in my chest. I thought the shadow figure had finally decided to cross the room and come for me. I clenched my eyes shut, held my breath, and braced for the worst. But then I heard this shaky, pathetic voice whispering near my shoulder. It was Marcus. He had dragged his own comforter across the gap, huddled right next to me on my tiny twin mattress, and frantically whispered that we were just going to share the bed for the rest of the night because it was big enough for both of us, and he was too freaked out to stay over there. It was surreal. This confident 30-something regional manager of mine was reduced to a trembling mess, begging his intern for a sleepover to hide from a ghost. We didn't say another word. We just laid there huddled together, completely silent, waiting for daylight to save us. We somehow survived until morning. The second the sun came up, we packed our crap at lightning speed and bolted. While we were checking out at the front desk, Marcus put on this ridiculous tough guy act, loudly complaining to the receptionist about the room quality being absolute garbage and totally subpar, clearly just trying to salvage his pride in front of me. We threw our bags in the trunk and drove straight to a local cafe to get some strong coffee before our big client meeting. We were sitting there sipping our drinks, watching the morning traffic, when Marcus finally broke the silence. He confessed that he didn't actually fall asleep after the whole blanket at the door incident. He told me that was only the first time. His blanket actually got yanked off his body a second time, shortly after I went back to my bed. He said by the time the third violent tug happened, he was absolutely convinced I was just playing a sick prank on him. So instead of yelling at me again, he decided to fake his heavy snores to catch me red-handed in the act. He told me he was lying there, eyes barely open in the dim light, waiting for me to make a move. Then he felt his thick comforter start sliding down from his neck. He said he immediately reached down and grabbed the top edges of the blanket near his shoulders, holding on as tight as he could. Then he tilted his head down to look at his feet. Under the faint glow of the bathroom nightlight, he saw it. A massive, pitch-black figure was crouching right at the end of his bed. Its dark arms were extended, fingers gripped tightly around the fabric, yanking it down over and over again with this violent, jerky movement. He told me he could hear the thick fabric catching and ripping against the wooden footboard, making this sickening, heavy friction sound over and over again. He said he panicked, looked over at my bed, and saw me completely passed out against the wall. That was the exact moment he realized he was playing a physical tug-of-war with something that was not human. It completely broke his brain. He said he was so fucking terrified that his survival instinct just kicked in. He told the thing it could keep the damn blanket since it belonged to the hotel anyway, and he completely let go of the fabric. But here is the detail that still makes my skin crawl. Marcus said the exact millisecond he released his grip, the shadow figure let go too. It didn't pull the blanket down to the floor. That shadow thing just completely vanished into thin air the exact millisecond he stopped pulling back, leaving the comforter resting completely still on his chest. That was when he scrambled off the mattress and jumped into my bed. Hearing him say all of that made my stomach turn inside out. I finally opened up and confessed to him about everything that happened when we first checked in. The deep voice asking what I was looking for, and the dark silhouette standing in the exact spot where he eventually tried to sleep. I told him I kept my mouth shut last night because I assumed he didn't believe in any of that paranormal stuff. He immediately snapped back, his eyes wide, asking who the hell ever told me he didn't believe in it. He firmly clarified that it was never about not believing. He explained that in his line of business, you just never ever talk about ghosts, because acknowledging them is basically inviting bad luck into your life. But after physically playing tug-of-war with one, he couldn't keep up the act anymore. After grabbing breakfast, we met with our clients, finished our business by early afternoon, and made the drive back without ever mentioning that room to anyone else at the company. Marcus eventually brought me on as a permanent staff member, and over the years, that trip became our favorite drunk story whenever we're out having beers after hours. We laugh about it now, but whenever the laughter dies down and the night gets quiet, neither of us ever tries to rationalize what actually pulled that blanket or who was standing in the dark. Some things are just better left buried in room 604. I have been clean for about 4 or 5 years now, married with kids, but I was a complete idiot when I was a teenager, man. Like I got expelled halfway through 9th grade and told my folks I was done with school, so I just spent my days loitering at coffee shops and pool halls. I would literally beg my mom for 20,000 dong a day, barely $1, and I would even take these fake mercenary gigs where guys paid me $2 to wave a weapon and scream at someone down the alley just to scare them. Word got around and this heavy-hitting local boss kinda took a liking to me. He was loaded, ran a huge cockfighting farm, owned coffee shops, restaurants, and drove a flashy car. He started calling me Little Vince and basically tossed me a gig managing the night shift at his private motel. Honestly, calling it a motel is a massive overstatement because this place was basically a concrete block hidden at the end of a dirt road, and it definitely was not meant for tourists or normal families on vacation. It was a haven for the boss's underlings, a cheap spot for sketchy hookups, and most importantly, it was a safe zone for the local junkies to get high without the cops busting their doors down. The setup was incredibly depressing. I would show up at 9 p.m. to relieve the day guy, and I would just sit behind this rotting wooden reception desk that always smelled like cheap bleach mixed with stale cigarette smoke. There was no air conditioning in the lobby, just this rusty ceiling fan clicking and wobbling overhead, a tiny tube TV, and some spotty Wi-Fi to keep myself awake. The job itself was ridiculously easy, which is why I took it despite the creepy atmosphere. I did not have to ask for any identification or make anyone sign a guest book. The rooms were cheap, like $3 for the first hour, maybe 4 for the second, and around $10 for the whole night. My only real responsibility was to hand out keys and carry a little plastic basket to the rooms. Whenever someone walked in, they would just tap on the counter, I would toss them a key attached to a heavy piece of plastic, and then I would put together this cheap plastic basket. Inside the basket, I had to put a sticky TV remote, 2 packets of generic shampoo, a couple of hard toothbrushes, and 2 bottles of water. Once the guest went to their room, I would wander down the hall, leave the basket on the table, walk out, and log the time in my notebook. That was it. During my first few days, I used to actually look up and greet the older gangsters respectfully, but after a while, I just stopped caring. Whoever knocked, I just tossed the key without even looking at their face. I know you guys listening probably think I am dragging this out, but you have to understand how mind-numbing this routine was, so you can grasp why my brain completely short-circuited when things started going wrong. I was so used to seeing absolute garbage human beings walking through those doors that my survival instinct was basically turned off. So it was a few days into my first week, and it was a really weird night because we actually had some normal people staying with us. Apparently, there was a big family wedding in the neighborhood, and the relatives ran out of sleeping space at their house, so they forced some of the overflow guests to rent a room at our sketchy dump. They were clearly disgusted by the place, complaining loudly about the stains and the smell before they finally dragged their bags into room 106. They had driven down from the city in 2 cars, a white sedan and a big black SUV, and they parked both of them right out front in the dirt lot. After they went to sleep, the motel got dead quiet. I was just lounging in my folding chair behind the desk, fighting off sleep while watching some blurry late-night shows. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe past 12:43 a.m. or something, but the absolute silence was suddenly broken by a sharp tapping on the wooden counter. I did not even bother looking up at first because I assumed it was just another junkie needing a place to crash. I reached over, grabbed the key for room 107, and slid it across the desk. When I did that, I caught a glimpse of the hand that grabbed it. It was this incredibly skinny skeletal arm, just pale skin stretched tightly over bone with blue veins bulging out, snatching the key with this jerky, unnatural motion. I heard the heavy plastic keychain jingling in this steady metallic rhythm as the person walked down the dark hallway toward the room. I yawned, rubbed my eyes, and slowly put together the plastic basket with the remote, the water bottles, and the toiletries. I dragged my feet down the hallway, expecting to just push the door open and leave the stuff on the table like always. But when I turned the knob for room 107, it was completely locked from the inside. I was instantly annoyed. I knocked on the door and raised my voice, telling the guy inside to open up so I could give him his TV remote and his water. Nobody answered me. The room behind the door was totally silent for a second, and then suddenly the TV inside turned on. This made absolutely zero sense because the remote was sitting right there in the plastic basket in my hands, and those old wall-mounted CRT TVs were the ancient antenna kinds that you had to physically twist a dial to change, so it couldn't just flip channels on its own. I stood there frozen as I heard the loud static noise of the TV scanning through channels in this aggressive crackling burst of white noise. It jumped from the news, to a movie, to traditional opera singing, before it finally stopped on a music channel, like Yon TV or ATV back in the day. It immediately started blasting some upbeat pop song at maximum volume, making the thin wooden door vibrate against my knuckles. I just shook my head and muttered to myself about how these freaking tweakers always ruined my shift. I figured the guy had brought his own universal remote, or something stupid like that, and he was already completely out of his mind on whatever chemicals he was doing. I carried the basket back to the reception desk, dropped it on the counter, and threw myself back into my folding chair, just trying to ignore the muffled thumping of the bass coming from down the hall. Keep in mind, room 107 was a whole 6 rooms away from the front desk, so hearing it that loudly was just ridiculous. I must have dozed off for a few minutes. Suddenly, there was another sharp tapping on the counter. My eyes snapped open, blurry and dry, and my muscle memory kicked in. I just grabbed a key, tossed it onto the desk, and immediately shut my eyes again. But literally 30 seconds later, Tap, tap, tap. I jerked my head up, and the key I had just put down was still sitting right there on the counter. I got a little pissed off and mumbled out loud, asking if the person was blind or something. I literally thought to myself, why don't you just drop dead so I can sleep? I finally looked up, and standing right in front of the desk was a man. He was dressed entirely in denim, wearing a faded denim jacket, dirty jeans, and a denim baseball cap pulled down so low that it completely cast a shadow over his face. I honestly wondered if his underwear was made of denim too. He stood completely still, his head tilted downward. He did not yell or act aggressive. He just mumbled in this raspy, hollow voice that he needed 2 bottles of water for room 107. I let out an annoyed sigh and told him that I had just tried to bring his stuff to the room, but he had locked me out. I told him I would just give him the basket right now so he could carry it himself. I turned around for maybe 2 seconds to grab the plastic basket off the back counter. When I turned back around, he was gone. I looked down both ends of the hallway, and there was absolutely no sign of him. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. It was like he had evaporated into the humid air. I was really starting to lose my patience at this point. I grabbed the basket, stomped down the hallway, and marched right up to room 107. The music was still booming through the door. I grabbed the handle, and this time, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked anymore. I pushed it open and stepped inside, expecting to see the guy in the denim jacket sprawled out on the mattress, but the room was completely empty. These rooms were tiny, so there was literally nowhere to hide. There was just the bare mattress, the buzzing wall fan, the blaring TV, and the bathroom. I looked over at the bathroom, and the door was wide open, revealing the small tiled space. Nobody was in there. The shower was dry. The toilet was empty. I stood there holding the basket, feeling this creeping sense of dread crawling up the back of my neck. I convinced myself that the guy must have slipped out to find his friends or something while I was walking down the hall. I took 3 steps into the room, placed the basket heavily on the small wooden table, and turned around to leave. As I was walking back toward the doorway, reaching my hand out to grab the edge of the door, something hit me. It was a massive, violent shove directly to the center of my back. It felt like 2 solid, freezing cold hands planting themselves between my shoulder blades and launching me forward. I stumbled hard, my arms flailing as I barely caught my balance before face-planting into the concrete hallway floor. As I was stumbling out, the door to room 107 slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash that rattled the walls. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my shoulders, trying to process the phantom pain radiating from my back. I stared at the closed door, completely bewildered. I tried to defend my own sanity, telling myself that the guy must have been hiding pressed flat behind the door in some weird drug-induced paranoia, and he just shoved me out so he could lock himself back in. It was a stupid excuse, but when you are a 15-year-old kid alone in a sketchy motel in the middle of the night, you force your brain to believe whatever keeps you from completely losing your mind. I walked back to the desk, rubbing my back, cursing under my breath. I sat down and tried to focus on my tiny TV screen, but my hands were shaking. About 15 minutes later, the door to room 106 opened. The older guy from the city who had parked the cars outside walked up to the desk wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. He looked furious. He complained bitterly that it was nearly 1:30 a.m. and the guy next door in 107 was playing music so loud that the bass was shaking their walls, and his 3 or 4 little kids couldn't sleep because the guy was also slamming his fists against the partition. He got right in my face and threatened to smack me upside the head, basically saying that if he didn't respect my boss, he would have beaten the crap out of me right there. I felt my stomach tie into a cold knot. I apologized profusely, told him I would go handle it, and promised to make the guy turn the TV off. Honestly, in any normal situation at this motel, nobody complained about the noise because everyone was doing illegal stuff anyway. But since this was a normal family, I had to do my job. I marched back down the hall to 107. The music was still thumping relentlessly. I raised my fist and banged loudly on the wood. The second my knuckles hit the door, the knob clicked, and the door slowly swung inward on its own, opening just a few inches with this awful, slow creaking sound. I pushed it open a bit further and peered inside. The lights were completely off now. The only light in that dump was the frantic, flashing blue glow from the TV screen. And right there, in the far corner of the room, wedged between the end of the bed and the bare wall, was the man. He was shirtless now, his pale, sickly skin glowing under the blue light. He was still wearing the dirty jeans and the denim cap, but he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing the corner, with his back to the door, hunched over like a toad in a hole with his hands resting on his thighs like he was meditating. He was literally just skin and bones. His spine was sticking out in these sharp, jagged bumps, and his ribs looked like they were going to tear through his skin. He was rocking back and forth in this repetitive, manic rhythm, completely ignoring me. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the absolute terror in my voice. I asked him politely to turn the music down because he was keeping the neighbors awake. He didn't respond. He just kept rocking, his bones shifting under his skin. I asked him again, a little louder. Still nothing. I figured he was completely paralyzed on whatever terrible drug he had injected, so I decided to just do it myself. The plastic basket was still sitting on the table, exactly where I had left it. The remote completely untouched. I took a deep breath, stepped into the dark room, and reached out for the remote. Before my fingers even grazed the plastic buttons, the volume on the TV began to lower itself. It didn't just mute instantly. The volume bar appeared on the screen and slowly ticked down, notch by notch, dragging out the decreasing sound until the room was completely silent except for the clicking of the ceiling fan. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked at the guy in the corner. He had not moved his arms at all. He was still sitting with his hands resting on his thighs, rocking back and forth. I backed away slowly, terrified to take my eyes off him. I made it to the doorway, stepped out into the hall, and the second my foot cleared the threshold, that same invisible freezing force slammed into my chest, shoving me backward into the opposite wall as the door slammed shut in my face again. I scrambled back to the reception desk, my chest heaving. I sat there hugging my knees, officially terrified. I promised myself I would not go near that hallway again until the sun came up, but the nightmare wasn't over. Not even close. About 20 minutes later, out in the dark dirt lot, both of the car alarms went off simultaneously. The blaring horns and flashing headlights cut through the silent night in this chaotic, aggressive, pulsing noise that made me jump out of my chair. I ran to the front entrance and looked out the glass doors. The white sedan was just flashing its lights, but the black SUV was physically moving. It was rocking violently from side to side, the heavy suspension squeaking and groaning as if someone massive was jumping up and down inside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out the front door. As I stepped into the humid night air, the car alarms abruptly cut out, leaving this ringing silence in my ears. I shined my light toward the SUV, and I swear to God, I saw the guy in the denim hat. He was sitting cross-legged right on the roof of the black SUV, rocking back and forth in the exact same manic rhythm as before. I yelled out, asking what the hell he thought he was doing on a customer's car. I slipped on my flip-flops to march out there and cuss him out. But when I looked up a second later, the roof of the SUV was completely empty. I walked closer, my legs feeling like lead. I shined my flashlight through the driver's side window of the locked SUV. He was inside. The man was sitting in the driver's seat, his head still tilted down, his pale hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes half closed and looking completely spaced out, like he was peaking on meth. Even though the engine was completely off and the power steering was dead, he was violently cranking the wheel back and forth. I heard the tires grinding against the concrete pavement in this awful squealing, stretching noise that made my teeth hurt, shifting the massive vehicle left and right while he sat locked inside. I completely lost it. I ran back inside, sprinted down the hall to room 106, and hammered on the door. I told the older guy that the crazy tweaker from next door had somehow broken into his locked car and was actively destroying it. The man cursed, grabbed his electronic keys, and ran outside in his bare feet. I chased after him. When we got to the dirt lot, the cars were perfectly still. The man pressed his unlock button, yanked the door of the SUV open, and checked the interior. There was absolutely no one inside. No damage. No sign of a break-in. He turned around and got right in my face, screaming at me, asking if I thought this was some kind of sick joke, and again threatened to beat me down for harassing a paying customer in the middle of the night. I was almost in tears. I tried to explain that I had seen the guy with my own 2 eyes, but the man just shoved past me, marching back inside. I followed him like a scared dog, apologizing the whole way. He reached room 106, gave me one last disgusted look, and stepped inside. As his door clicked shut, the door to room 107 slowly creaked open. Just a few inches. The hallway was dimly lit, but I could clearly see the man in the denim hat standing in the gap. He had both hands gripping the door frame, his knuckles white. His face was still mostly hidden by the shadow of the cap, but the lower half of his face was visible. He was smirking. It was this wide, unnatural, stretching smile that bared his teeth in the darkness, a silent, mocking grin that completely broke my brain. I backed away, my heart hammering so hard I thought it was going to crack my ribs, and I practically sprinted back to the front desk. I sat there in pure agony for another hour. Around 2:30 a.m., a group of about 5 sketchy guys pulled up in a couple of beat-up sedans. They were obvious junkies, tweaking and looking for a place to light up. The lead guy came to the desk and slapped some cash down, asking for a room. I was so exhausted and terrified I just shook my head and told them we were completely booked. The guy scoffed, pointing down the hallway. He argued that room 107 was sitting wide open. The bed was totally unmade, and nobody was inside. He accused me of trying to hold out on them. I was too tired to argue. I just shoved the money in the drawer and told them to take it if they wanted it. They grabbed a bunch of waters and headed down the hall, laughing and carrying their stash, their rigs, pipes, and gear. I sat back, staring at the clock, praying for the sun to rise. Exactly 7 minutes later, the chaotic sound of boots tearing down the hallway echoed through the lobby. All 5 of the guys came sprinting around the corner, tripping over each other in sheer panic. One guy didn't even have his shirt on properly, just wearing it slung over his neck as he ran. They bolted out the front doors, practically jumping over each other to get into their cars. They were screaming at the top of their lungs about how they had just seen Soren, sounding completely out of their minds. They cranked their engines and tore out of the dirt lot, peeling rubber and disappearing into the night, leaving the front door swinging open behind them. I stood behind the desk, completely paralyzed. You have to understand, drug addicts at that level do not abandon their stash unless they are facing a SWAT team or death. I slowly walked down to room 107. The lights were on, the bed was a mess, and right there on the mattress, perfectly untouched, were their pipes, lighters, and a small bag of crystal meth. Whatever they saw had terrified them so badly, they left hundreds of dollars worth of drugs behind. I quickly gathered their stash, stuffed it into a plastic bag, and hid it in a drawer back at the desk, knowing they would eventually come back for it. Sure enough, about 15 minutes later, the lead junkie crept back into the lobby, looking around like a frightened animal. He quietly asked me for his stuff. I handed him the bag and asked him what the hell had happened, and why they were running from someone named Soren. The guy looked at me, his face completely pale and sweating. He asked me how long I had been working there. I told him it had only been a few days. He let out a shaky breath and explained everything. He told me that Soren was a local addict who preferred shooting up rather than smoking. About 3 weeks before I started working there, Soren had rented room 107 by himself. He had shot up a bad batch, overdosed, and died right there on the bathroom floor. The boss was a powerful guy, so he bribed the local cops, paid off the family for the funeral, and completely buried the story so the motel wouldn't get shut down. None of the new staff knew about it. The junkie wiped his face and told me that when they went into the room, they started unpacking their gear on the bed. Suddenly, they heard this wet, ragged sniffing sound coming from the bathroom, like someone gasping for air. They looked over, and sitting right next to the toilet, hunched over in a denim jacket and a baseball cap, was Soren, slumped against the toilet bowl. He said the ghost was sitting there in the dark, acting out his own death, repeating his final moments of overdose over and over again. I basically ran for my life that morning when the sun finally came up, and I completely wrote off the few bucks I was supposed to get paid for the week, because there was no way I was ever stepping foot in that place again. I spent a few days hiding out, thinking the big boss was going to send someone to rough me up for abandoning my post, but he completely ignored it. Turns out it didn't even matter, because Soren's ghost completely ruined the business in a matter of months, haunting every single person who rented a room and scaring away every junkie and night guard in town. The boss eventually just got fed up, cut his losses, brought in bulldozers, and leveled the entire property to expand his cockfighting farm.